Chapter 106. The Qinling Mountains lay across the border between the north and the south of Wuxia. It was the mountains that divided the north and the south, the earth cut the rivers and the east and west meandered. The vast momentum and continuous magnificence made it difficult for people to see the whole picture, but they had to explore. The world was big and chaotic. It was rare that the mountains were still there. The fog was rising and the snow was boundless. It was an otherworldly scene. Unlike the handsomeness of Mount Immerse, the Qinling Mountains gave people a sense of vastness. After going up the mountain, the little fellow obediently lay in Xianxia's arms, her big eyes rolling. As the altitude increased, the snow on the mountain became thicker and thicker. The somewhat rugged and slippery path was gradually covered by the snow. Looking up, it seemed that there was only white left between heaven and earth. When the little fellow saw the thick snow piled up like a quilt, she finally couldn't help but hug Xianxia's neck and said coquettishly, "Papa, Papa, I want to play in the snow." Hearing this, Xianxia stopped, pinched her little face and then put her down in a relatively flat place. Seeing the thick layer of snow in front of her, the little fellow also became playful. She was holding the big cat and suddenly swung her arms with all her strength. Just like that, he threw the big cat into the pile of snow. The big cat was shocked and suddenly it was so scared that it waved its 4 feet in the air. But because it had no place to borrow strength, it could only watch as the little fellow threw it out. Poof! It was now the size of a pet cat, so after falling into the snow, it only made a small shallow hole. Meow. The big cat cried out with some dissatisfaction, causing the little fellow to giggle. Then she hopped to the edge of the pile of snow and shouted, "I'm here." Then he jumped into the snow as well. The snow looked as soft as cotton, but it was definitely not as warm and cold as cotton. But after she jumped into the snow, she immediately rolled in it as if she was not afraid of the cold at all. Her wish of rolling in the snow finally came true. While Little Rascal and Big Cat were rolling around in the snow, Xianxia looked at Qin Xueqing and suddenly asked, "What do you think? Is my daughter cute?" This was the second time that Xianxia had asked this question. Qin Xueqing looked at him with a complicated expression, and then turned her eyes to the little fellow. A 4-year-old child was the cutest, so no matter how unwilling she was, Qin Xueqing could only reply dryly, "Cute." "Thank you." Xianxia smiled and nodded as if he was very satisfied with her answer. Qin Xueqing wanted to say something. But when she thought about how Xianxia had threatened to burn her to death, she couldn't help but sulk. She walked to the side alone and sulked. The conversation stopped abruptly. The huge mountain was very quiet. Only the little fellow's shouts could be heard. The cold wind in the mountain whistled and a series of snowflakes swirled in the sky, drifting toward the foot of Mount Qinling. After playing for a while, the little fellow found that it was really cold, so she ran back. "Papa. So cold, so cold." As she spoke, she jumped and shivered. The process of melting snow itself was a process of absorbing heat. When rolling in the snow would fall into the clothes. As soon as it met the body temperature, it would immediately melt into water. So no matter how much she liked the snow, she had to run back to Xianxia to get warm. Xianxia quickly picked her up. As his true essence surged, Little Rascal's body immediately emitted a faint white gas. A stream of warmth wrapped her, and Little Rascal immediately murmured comfortably, "It's so warm. Papa's so warm." When it could freeload food and drink, Big Cat would never be willing to fall behind others. So when it saw Little Rascal being held by Xianxia, it immediately shook off the snow on its body and jumped into Little Rascal's arms like a mad dog. The reason why it was willing to follow Xianxia was that a trace of Xianxia's true essence inadvertently leaked out was enough for it to benefit a lot. When the heavy snow closed the mountain, there were no birds in the mountains and no traces of people could be found. But even a master of peak strength could walk on water, not to mention Qin Xueqing, who was a guru. Perhaps it was because she wanted to compete with Xianxia, so as soon as she entered the mountain she stepped on the snow and floated away. In an instant she had already rushed several meters away. A guru was like a dragon, climbing the mountain like an ape, diving into the water like an otter, and his momentum was like Mount Tai. After being tortured by Xianxia, Qin Xueqing almost doubted whether she was still a Wu Dao guru. Now that his sister-in-law was willing to cooperate, Xianxia naturally would not provoke her for no reason, so he followed her leisurely. As the two of them moved forward quickly, they went deep into the hinterland of the Qinling Mountains in the blink of an eye. At this time, Xianxia also roughly guessed where the mysterious place she was talking about was. Because as they went deeper and deeper, Xianxia found that the spiritual qi of heaven and earth here was even richer than that of Zongnanhai. It was really a good place for all things to compete. After walking for more than an hour, Qin Xueqing suddenly stopped. Xianxia looked at the valley in front of her and also stopped. Because he knew that Qin Xueqing had something to say. Sure enough, after Qin Xueqing stopped, she turned her head, and the expression on her face showed that she was struggling. Xianxia waited for her for a moment, then she said in a seemingly annoyed tone, "I was wrong, I shouldn't have brought you here. Even if you kill me now, I won't take you one step further. Without me leading the way, you won't be able to enter, so you should go back. Since we're already here, do you think it's possible for me to go back? You really can't go any further. If you do this, not only will you kill yourself and my sister, but you will also kill the child in your arms. For the sake of the child, please go back, okay? Go back first, and when the divine gate opens, I will naturally come back to find you." Qin Xueqing became more and more agitated as she spoke. In the end, she could not help but yell at Xianxia again. Xianxia did not reply. After she calmed down a little, he nodded at Qin Xueqing and said very solemnly, "Thank you." Qin Xueqing was stunned for a moment, then she flew into a rage and her face turned red. Just as she was about to scold Xianxia suddenly asked, "You're a grandmaster, so what's the corresponding realm of a grandmaster? I don't have time to joke with you. I'm warning you, if you go any further you will really kill everyone. Answer my question first." Xianxia's expression was very serious, as if he was seriously discussing something with her. Seeing this, Qin Xueqing stomped her foot and said impatiently, "Entering the Tao. What's above that? Cultivating the Tao. Above that? Aren't you at the divine connection realm? Answer my question first, then what's above that? Core condensation. Isn't Grandmaster controlled Dan? What's the difference between core controlled Dan and core condensation? The two can't be described in the same sentence. Legend has it that when a Grandmaster successfully condenses his Dan, he will be able to leave the earth and ascend to immortality, free and unfettered between heaven and earth. Core concentration refers to a martial artist condensing the essence, qi and blood marrow of the entire body into a single point. In other words, all the strength in the body is concentrated in the dantian. When facing an enemy, the dantian will explode and the enemy will be killed in a single move. Alright, I have no more questions. After saying that, Xianxia carried the little fellow and walked towards the valley. Qin Xueqing wanted to reach out and stop him, but when she thought about how she was not a match for him, she could not help but stop. Obviously, Xianxia had tortured her until she was traumatized. Helpless, Qin Xueqing could only stomp her foot and shout at Xianxia's back, "I've said it before, without me leading the way you can't enter." Just as she finished speaking, the scene in front of her stunned her. Xianxia waved his sleeves lightly, and a door of light rippled like the surface of a lake appeared in front of him. Behind the door, at the entrance of the valley, a stone tablet suddenly appeared in the originally empty space. On the stone tablet were two large words written in small seal script. Chapter 107. The little fellow stared blankly at the light gate that suddenly appeared in front of her. This door of light was transparent. If it wasn't for the faint light it was emitting and the ripples it was emitting, it would really look like an ordinary glass door. Even an adult would not be able to understand this situation, let alone a 4-year-old girl. "Papa, what's this?" The little girl stared at Xianxia with her cute big eyes, and after looking at Xianxia with a surprised expression, she stretched out her left index finger and gently poked at the door of light. Then when her finger touched the light gate she felt nothing. It was as if she was touching air. Her finger went through the light gate as if she was putting her hand into water. The surface of the water kept shaking and her fingers started to shake as well. The light gate shook and so did her finger. The little fellow was amused. She stretched out her finger and kept poking the light gate. She felt nothing, but when she saw her finger rippling with the ripples, she giggled happily. Looking at her happy little face, Xianxia couldn't help but ask with a smile, "Do you like it?" "I like it. So fun." The little fellow giggled and lay on Xianxia's arm. Then she raised her head high and her little chin was almost in the sky. "Papa will take you in to play, okay?" "Okay." The father and daughter quickly reached a consensus. Then Xianxia looked back at Qin Xueqing and asked with a smile, "What about you? Do you want to go with us?" Qin Xueqing looked at him in a daze. This mountain guarding formation was left by the ancient sages. How could it fail? Xianxia looked at her strangely. Seeing that she didn't speak, he stepped directly into the light gate with the little fellow in his arms. Wait. I'll go with you. At this time, Xianxia suddenly reacted and ran after him. I'll take you in. But you'd better leave her here. Don't you still have a monster? If you let this monster keep an eye on her, there shouldn't be any problem. I'll go in with you. It'll be more convenient for us to move around. Xianxia pointed at the big cat in the little fellow's arms, trying to persuade Xianxia to leave the little fellow outside. Hearing this, Xianxia gently shook his head and answered with certainty, Ying is my wife and Yan Yan's mother. Since it's to bring her mother home, how can she be absent? After that, Xianxia lowered his head and glanced at the little fellow. Although the little fellow did not understand the meaning of Xianxia, she understood the meaning of Xianxia's words. Therefore she immediately said excitedly, I want to take Mama home. As she spoke, the little girl seemed to be a little embarrassed. She buried her little face in Xianxia's chest. Bashfully sitting in Xianxia's arms, she kept twisting her small body. The word, mother, had already become a simple concept in her mind. Other children had mothers, so naturally she should have a mother too. This was all she knew about her mother. Although she was a little unfamiliar with it, she still had some desire. Xianxia touched the little fellow's head and smiled at Xianxia. He carried the little fellow and walked straight to the valley in front. Xianxia's expression was a little uncertain. While she was still hesitating, Xianxia was almost at the side of the stone tablet. Seeing this, Xianxia could only stomp her feet and shout, Wait! I'll take you there. After saying that, she also stepped through the door of light. When she stepped through the door of light, it suddenly disappeared. Xianxia looked at the original position of the light door with a complicated expression. After shaking her head, she quickly caught up with Xianxia. After passing the stone tablet, they entered the valley. A seemingly ancient village suddenly appeared in front of Xianxia. It was as if it was recorded in the peach blossom spring. After dozens of steps, it suddenly became clear. The land was flat and the houses were upright. There were fertile fields, beautiful ponds, mulberry trees and bamboo trees. The roads were crisscrossed and chickens and dogs could be heard. However, it was a pity that it was winter now and snow was falling from the sky. Therefore, standing outside the village, there was no one at all. Xianxia came from behind. After passing by Xianxia, she led Xianxia quietly into the village. This village was actually very big and there were probably hundreds of families. Xianxia's pretty face was tense, and she was almost in her battle state. Along the way she had clearly stepped on the snow, but she did not leave any footprints. Looking at her cautious appearance, she was no different from a thief. The village was very quiet. At this time the little fellow turned her little head and said with some doubts, Papa, it's so strange here. Her voice was not loud, but in Xianxia's ears, it was no different from a sudden clap of thunder. Hence she was immediately given a huge fright as every strand of hair on her body stood on end. Xianxia quickly turned her head and glared at the little fellow fiercely. Being glared at so fiercely, the little fellow was a little frightened. She quickly pouted and shrank into Xianxia's arms. Seeing this, Xianxia also glared at Xianxia fiercely. At the same time he did not forget to threaten her, If you dare to glare at her again, I will gouge out your eyes. Xianxia was just about to say something, but she immediately realized that now was not the time to quarrel. Therefore she had to take a deep breath and suppress the evil fire in the bottom of her heart. At this time Xianxia ignored her and continued to walk forward. Seeing this, Xianxia suddenly became anxious. She quickly floated in front of Xianxia and pointed to a side path, indicating that he should go around it. However, Xianxia did not pay attention to her at all. He carried the little fellow and walked straight ahead. There was a large square in the center of the village. It was about the size of 2 basketball courts. In the center there was an ancient bronze cauldron about 2 meters high. Because of the heavy snow, the ancient cauldron had been covered with a thick layer of snow. There were even a few icicles hanging from the protruding ears of the cauldron. In the north of the square, there was an old building that looked like an ancestral hall. The door of the old building was closed tightly, and it looked quite solemn. Xianxia did not seem to need Xianxia to lead the way. After arriving at the square, he went straight through the square, and then walked quickly up the mountain along a small path in the northwest corner of the square. Xianxia followed behind him looking nervous. She wanted to say something but she did not dare to make a sound. She wanted to stop Xianxia but she was afraid that she would be made by Xianxia again. So she had to follow Xianxia helplessly, constantly looking around for fear that someone would discover them. Behind the ancestral hall, there was a small hill, estimated to be about 20 or 30 meters high. There was only a winding path to go up. Xianxia came to the foot of the hill and looked at the small hill thoughtfully. When he saw the circle of walls on the hill, there were some subtle changes in his eyes. Qin Xueqing noticed Xianxia's strange behavior. Just as she was about to approach Xianxia and was about to say something to him, Xianxia suddenly carried the little fellow and flew straight up. Qin Xueqing hesitated for a moment. But it was too late for her to regret it now. So she had to look as if she was facing death calmly and quickly jumped up with Xianxia. Again, it's not a matter of money. It's that I really can't write it. Even if I write something, it never reaches the feeling I want. The more I write, the more dissatisfied I am. I delete and rewrite and still not satisfied, delete and rewrite again. In short, it's up to me if I can get through this. I've forgotten to thank all the bosses for their 10,000 coin rewards. Now that they're all together, thank you to the boss of Immerse for your 10,000 reward. Thank you to the boss of Xiaxia for your 20,000 reward. Thank you to the boss of Little Devil Child and Little Urchin for your 10,500 reward. Thank you to brother Katatsumuri for your 10,000 reward. Thank you to the boss of Sanyu Wu Mengxing for your 10,000 reward. Thank you to the boss of God with Nothing to Do for your 9,000 reward. Thank you to the boss of Riding a Turtle to the Heavens for your 11,500 reward. Thank you to the boss of Rising Dawn Withering Summer Flowers for your 10,000 reward. Thank you to the boss of Sanhua Feng for your 10,000 reward. Chapter 108. Xianxia had already flown with the little fellow once. So this time she didn't seem to be too excited. There was only a small courtyard on the hillside behind the ancestral hall. Xianxia didn't fly directly into the courtyard. Instead he stopped outside the door. Inside and outside the door. Inside and behind the wall. The little fellow seemed to have noticed something. She tilted her head and glanced at Xianxia, only to find that her father's lips were tightly pursed. He seemed to be a little nervous. So she wrapped her arms around Xianxia's neck and slowly pressed her ear against Xianxia's chest, as if she wanted to hear his heartbeat. Xianxia didn't hesitate too much. He waved his arm gently and the courtyard door opened automatically. Small courtyard pavilion. Stone table guqin. She was dressed in white, standing in the snow, looking up at the sky in a daze. The woman heard the movement and slowly turned her head to look at the courtyard door. Immediately after, the sorrow on her face turned into astonishment. But after a moment, those astonishment all turned into uncontrollable excitement and anger. She wanted to see that familiar face again, but the tears that she couldn't help blurred her eyes in the blink of an eye. Ying, I'm sorry. Xianxia held the little girl in her arms and strode towards her, shrinking the ground into an inch. In a flash, the little fellow curled up in Xianxia's arms. Although her face was a little timid, her big eyes were still staring straight at the woman in white in front of her. The woman didn't seem to be prepared. In the blink of an eye, Xianxia, who was standing outside the courtyard just now, appeared in front of her at this moment. This frightened her so much that she couldn't help but take a step back. It's me. I'm back. Xianxia held the little fellow in one hand and pulled her with the other. However, what he got in response was a resounding slap. Slap. The woman didn't speak. After glancing at him, she quickly lowered her head to look at the little fellow in his arms. The tears that had already welled up in her eyes suddenly gushed out crazily as if a dam had been opened. She no longer paid attention to Xianxia, but looked at the little guy in his arms. Nian, is that you? The woman looked at the little fellow in Xianxia's arms. When she saw the little fellow's cute little face, she couldn't help but smile as she cried. She stretched out her trembling hands, wanting to take the little fellow from Xianxia's arms. However, the little fellow shyly hugged Xianxia and twisted his body to avoid the woman's hand. That nervous and uneasy look was just like the first time Xianxia saw her. When the woman saw the little fellow's confused and nervous expression, she felt as if her heart had been ruthlessly stabbed by a knife. That heart-wrenching pain was almost unbearable. How can she be a mother if she doesn't raise her child? That was why her daughter was so unfamiliar with her when she was already so old. This was retribution. Seeing this, Xianxia hurriedly said to the little fellow, "Nian Nian, call me mommy. Do you remember what mommy looks like? Do you remember that you've been looking at family photos every day? Think about it. This is mommy." The little fellow clutched Xianxia's clothes tightly. She looked uneasily at the crying woman in front of her. She hesitated for a moment. Then she suddenly stretched out her little hand to the woman and said softly, "Mommy." The woman was stunned as if she couldn't believe her ears. Seeing this, the little fellow raised her voice and shouted again, "Mommy, hug." The woman trembled and stretched out her hands again. And this time the little fellow took the initiative to reach out her hands to her. She stiffly took the little fellow from Xianxia's arms. The little fellow wrapped her arms around her neck. Seeing that her tears were still flowing, she stretched out her little hand to wipe her face and said very sensibly, "Mommy, don't cry. You won't be beautiful if you cry." The woman stared blankly at the little fellow, quietly feeling the warmth from her hands, but her tears still fell uncontrollably. The little fellow wiped her tears. Seeing that she was still crying, she wrapped her arms around her neck and leaned on her body, saying softly, "Mommy is a great beauty. Don't cry. You won't be beautiful if you cry. If mommy isn't beautiful, I won't be beautiful when I grow up." The child was so sensible. The woman suddenly broke down. She hugged the little fellow tightly and slowly squatted on the ground. Her crying was so heart-wrenching, as if she was a Xianglin sister-in-law whose child was taken away by a wolf. It was so sad that it could break one's heart. The little fellow was very sensible. She hugged the woman and comforted her. "Mommy, don't cry, don't cry." As she spoke, she used her little hand to gently pat the woman's back. Xianxia stood silently by the side, looking at his lover's crying appearance. He couldn't help but have mixed feelings. Time had faded her immaturity and draped her with a trace of vicissitudes of life. He couldn't avoid that slap. "Qin Ruing. Qin Ruing." Perhaps the little fellow's comforting words were effective. The woman gradually stopped crying. After calming herself down, she gently let go of the little fellow. Then she held her hand and stood up again. Her eyes were slightly red, and when she looked at the little fellow, her eyes were filled with love. But when she looked at Xianxia, her gaze became very complicated. After hesitating for a moment, she said softly, "Why do you want to leave?" Her voice was very soft and it sounded as if there were no emotions. Xianxia's heart immediately rose to his throat. After hesitating for a moment, Xianxia suddenly formed a seal, then lightly tapped the woman's forehead. The woman was stunned. Then the huge amount of memories crazily rushed into her mind like a tide. Heavenly Jade World. Heavenly Yen Divine Sect. Servant Disciple. Xianxia at that time. Hesitation, struggle, helplessness, loss, but most of all, pain. It seemed like a simple move, but because Xianxia forcefully used his soul, he immediately suffered a backlash and he couldn't help but let out a muffled groan. After hearing Xianxia's groan, Qin Ruiying immediately reacted and hurriedly shouted, "That's enough." Seeing him in pain, she couldn't help but cry anxiously. Xianxia's first few years of memories in Heavenly Jade World also made her finally understand. What exactly had he experienced all these years? "I miss you so much." Qin Ruiying threw herself into Xianxia's arms, then leaned her head on his chest and tears fell like rain. Xianxia gently hugged her. She raised her head and looked at Xianxia's face, which had become much paler in an instant, and couldn't help but murmur, "Do you know? After you left, I made a wish." Hearing this, Xianxia could only endure the pain caused by using his soul and reluctantly asked, "What wish?" "I wish that after leaving for half your life, you'll return as a young man." Her gaze was as clear as that day on Middle Mountain Road. There were tears at the corners of her eyes, but she suddenly smiled. Yingying's smile was charming. Seeing this, Xianxia smiled with her. It was as if he had returned to the summer when he mustered the courage to confess his love. "Everything is as you wish." With that, Xianxia gently pulled Qin Ruiying into his arms. He lowered his head and gently kissed those two slightly cold red lips. This kiss was 5 years apart. This kiss was 500 years apart. "From now on, I only wish to be with you for the rest of my life." Qin Xueqing stood outside the courtyard, not daring to enter. When she saw the two of them kissing, she seemed to finally understand something. 2 lines of clear tears kept falling down her cheeks, but the corners of her mouth raised slightly. But at this moment an angry voice suddenly sounded. "Yuanqing, what are you doing?" The smile on Qin Shuiqing's face immediately disappeared. She retreated to the courtyard, somewhat afraid. And this also alarmed the two of them who were having an intimate moment in the courtyard. Seeing this, Qin Ruiying suddenly remembered something, and hurriedly pulled Xianxia to the house next door. Quick, take Nian Yan and leave first. At this moment her face was full of panic, and there was no trace of happiness and sweetness on her face. However, at this moment, Xianxia gently held her hand and said very gently, "Don't be afraid, I'm here." Qin Ruiying still wanted to say something, but Xianxia pulled her into his arms and blocked her words with his mouth. "Papa, you're shameless. Shame. The little fellow was held by Qin Ruiying. As soon as she saw Xianxia kissing her again, she immediately giggled excitedly. "Are you crazy? Why are you still here?" Qin Shuiqing suddenly rushed over and tried to push Xianxia away. But before she could get close, she had been restrained by Xianxia again. Then Xianxia gently let go of Qin Ruiying and then asked very seriously, "Since I'm here, I must take you home today. Do you believe me?" Qin Ruiying was stunned for a moment. However, she quickly nodded her head and replied solemnly, "I believe you." Xianxia gently touched her face and then bent down to pick up the little fellow. He held the little fellow in his left hand and held Qin Ruiying in his right hand. The family of three faced the gate of the courtyard like this. There were more and more people outside the courtyard. In the end, even an old man with white hair and beard was alarmed. As soon as the old man walked into the courtyard, he saw Xianxia's unfamiliar face. And when he saw the little fellow in Xianxia's arms, he couldn't help but change his expression greatly. He pointed at the little fellow and scolded sternly, "Who is she?" Xianxia silently looked at everyone in front of him. Finally, his eyes stopped on the old man. Then he turned to the big cat and said, "Big cat." The big cat had been squatting nearby and watching the fun. After hearing Xianxia's voice, it immediately jumped out and responded with a meow. "Get the carriage, meow." The big cat tilted its head as if it didn't understand. "Let's go home." His voice was as loud as a bell and as loud as thunder. The negative emotions that had accumulated for more than 500 years finally broke out at this moment. This is the last chapter before the release. The next chapter will be released on January 1st, 2018 at 5 o'clock. After the female lead comes out, I think I still have a conscience. It's still the same sentence. Don't force people to donate monthly votes and let fate decide. Everyone has a difficult time. If you have money, you can help others, but if you don't, you can help others. Friends who watch pirated versions, remember to come back and give me 2 recommendation votes. It's a kind of support. As for those who don't have anything and still want to talk nonsense after watching it for free, forget it, I won't say it. This chapter's BGM, The Snow Between the Eyebrows Swordnet San's love song, was changed into an official video by Swordnet San. Countless people cried after listening to it. I strongly recommend you to listen to the story version, not the pure song version. I'm in Shuangming Town, my name is West Window White Pure Yang. But I miss you, it's useless to know. Not throwing you away but finding you in dreams. After waking up I'm on the balcony with dreams. West Window White, the cold moon, a yard full of snow. The first chapter. The sword has not been properly equipped, but I'm already in Jianghu, and the second chapter. The wine is still warm but I don't know the universe, to be continued. Chapter 109. It's up. Let's not talk about empty words. I'm trying my best to write as much as I can. I've saved a chapter and a half and will publish it after midnight. Anyway, I'll just write as much as I can today. I won't compete with others because I really can't write. There's only one sentence. I can't give you the quantity but I can give you the quality. So I hope you can give me your support and understanding, okay? For example, come and spend a dime to give me a first order? That's not too much. Thank you for your support, especially those who supported the original version. And every single one of them who had tipped and supported. Heart to heart. I'll say the same thing. I don't mind pirated readers, but I'll try my best to encourage you to read the original version. Those who have money will support me and those who don't will support me. Everyone has their difficulties, so I won't reject pirated readers. I won't open an anti-piracy website. I won't sell myself as poor or miserable. Because I've been writing novels for more than 10 years. Except for this one, I haven't even earned back the courier fees for the others. If I don't find a job, I'm afraid I'll starve to death. Well, I've opened a takeaway shop before, so I know a lot about takeaway. So I don't understand what some authors are thinking. They can't even afford to eat, so why don't they go out to work? If they go out to work and improve themselves in society, the things they write should be better than writing behind closed doors, right? Anyway, that's how I got through. Once this book is up, I should be able to get rid of the title of flop. Thank you, all of you. Without you, I wouldn't be able to make a comeback today. You've also made me feel what it means to be pushed to the top. In 2005, I started my first book on Qidian. I wrote more than 100,000 words, but I didn't sign a contract. For the past 12 years, I'll write and submit when I'm free to see if I can sign a contract. The first time I signed a contract was in 2010. The longest book was more than 700,000 words. There were 2 subscriptions and each of them was 13. Xuanhuan, fantasy, Xianxia, sci-fi, urban, supernatural, including female genre and countless subcategories. I've written about everything except history and military affairs, which I haven't really written about yet. They all flopped. This book was also the first time I was pushed to the top by Sanjiang. I just want to encourage all of you. Please believe that God won't let you down. Your hard work today will pay off one day. It may be late, but it will never be absent. Let's talk about this book. I want to write a book that you will still talk about years later. No matter how many flaws it has, it is a work that I have put my heart and soul into. To be honest, I've already written so much that I've cried several times. What he had written had moved him to tears. Thinking about it, it was really strange. A lot of readers, actually they're just posers, after reading the first chapter, scolded me for writing old-fashioned stuff, and started scolding me after reading 10 lines at a glance. To be honest, they might look down on my first chapter and think that my first chapter is very old-fashioned. But in fact, when I finished the first chapter, I had already cried. At that time, I had a very strange feeling. I was neither happy nor sad. There were clearly no fluctuations in my emotions, but I still shed tears. And that was only when I was writing the first chapter. Later, when I reached chapter 40, I cried again. In chapter 45, I also cried. However, many people praised chapter 55, saying that it was the highest quality chapter, but I didn't have any reaction. There were a few chapters after that. There were tears, but it wasn't enough. Until chapter 93. I was stuck at chapter 93 for a long time. But when I wrote the last paragraph, I shed tears again. If an author can write until they cry, I feel that I have succeeded. If it was an old author or an old reader, when they saw the title of my book, they could already come to a conclusion. This book has too many restrictions. Because the core of Cultivation and Stay-at-Home Dad are conflicting. One is to train and fight monsters, the other is to live a warm life. Also, the timeline of Stay-at-Home Dad novels is very short, but the timeline of Cultivation is thousands of years. To be able to write such a result was something that I didn't expect at all, so I didn't save any chapters. Every chapter was written and published on the spot. To be able to write and publish on the spot to reach this level, I'm actually very satisfied. If it wasn't serialized, I think I could write even better. Chapter 107, I'm very satisfied. I hope you leave for half your life and return as a teenager. I didn't dawdle for half a day in vain. From the perspective of making money, chapter 107 shouldn't be a free chapter. If I were to open another book, I would definitely save 200,000 before publishing it. It's too difficult to not save any chapters. Let's talk about the update. I hope you can understand, I also want to write more, but I really can't do it. It's not that I'm not working hard, but I've already tried my best. To say something arrogant, I feel that the quality of my book is okay. For example, in chapter 97, when Ning Zhonghua called, I could actually choose to open a branch here and expand it into a complete set of pretentious face-slapping scenes. But I have other plots in my mind. I think the plots in my mind are more meaningful than these face-slapping scenes, so I don't want to write that. This also causes me to write very slowly because I write every chapter very carefully, racking my brain to think about it. Even if it's a confirmed plot, I will repeatedly think about it because I'm afraid I can't control it. My way of writing also causes a lot of people to just skim through it. They might not even notice some details. Of course, even if you skip some of the key things that I think are the starting point, it won't affect the subsequent reading. This is the charm of online literature. If it's not good, I'll skip it. There will always be something I like. If there's really nothing that attracts me, okay, I'll abandon the book. I'm not an illiterate. I used to write brainless novels. But now, since I've chosen this topic, I have to write it properly. It's really hard to write, much harder than routine novels. So, I'd rather write the background setting that you don't want to see the most, rather than write these small branches. I hope you can understand my thoughts. Please forgive me. 2 chapters a day, try to keep it up. If you can write more, then add more. In any case, it's a serious promotion. In order to cherish this opportunity, I'll nag a bit more. Actually, I really didn't ask for recommendation tickets, rewards, or anything like that, so I'm very sorry for Jia and everyone's rewards. Other people have to add more chapters for rewards, but I don't have anything here, so I don't dare to ask for rewards or recommendations. It's not that I don't want to, it's that I don't dare. Because I don't have a way to add more chapters. Sorry. I'm very grateful for everyone's support, especially those who have been voting since I started writing tens of thousands of words. There are more and more voting IDs. I can actually see a few familiar ones. It's really deep. I was a failure in the past, so monthly votes are a very distant thing to me. So, even if I've been in a fight before, I've never cared about it. I don't dare to think about it. I'm a failure. Why think so much? The monthly votes are for me to play with. Because I'm too calm. Even after achieving today's results, I still feel like I'm living in a dream. In the past, when I slept, there was still no change in my collection. But now, in the blink of an eye, my collection has increased again. It's all thanks to everyone's support that I can achieve today's results. Thank you. I may focus on different things from other authors. I prefer to pay attention to the readers' comments. So, you often see me in the comments section or when I open a chapter. I don't care too much about the results, but I care a lot about your comments. So, when I see some people deliberately belittling my hard work, I get very angry. Especially those who say that it's highly toxic and has already been appraised. I'm really speechless. But I care a lot about the readers' comments, so I often get angry. One last thing. I'm a pure newbie author. I don't have any achievements from previous books and I'm writing alone. I don't have any support from old readers, I don't have any author friends, and I don't have any data. My updates are so weak. But I can reach 50,000 favorites at Qidian with 200,000 words. How many are there? Some idiots say that I'm manipulating data. They don't know, but they pretend to know. The number of subscribers, the number of fans, these are all roughly proportional. Whether I'm manipulating or not, any old author will be able to tell at a glance. I have such good results. Why do I need to manipulate my results to court death? Use your poor brain. Since my first recommendation, I've always been the first in the category of new books. Category strong recommendation, 6 bands, 3 rivers, bookshelves, strong recommendation. When have I ever lost? I don't have many recommendations because I'm a newbie and it's a city category, so it's hard to get a recommendation, and the editor didn't give me any extra recommendations. So, thank you for your support, brothers. Without you, I wouldn't have achieved today's results. Thank you for giving a failure for more than 10 years a chance to make a comeback. Thank you. December 31st, 2017. Yours truly. Happy New Year. I hope that in the coming year you and I will still be side by side. A VIP book group. 5178611243. Chapter 110. A lot of people suddenly poured into the yard. These people were either men or women, old or young. They stood near the gate of the yard, looking at the family of 3 in the yard with unkind expressions. An old man with white hair and beard pushed the crowd out. When he saw Xianxia holding the child in one hand and holding Qin Ruing in the other, he was so angry that even his beard trembled. The old man's eyes flashed with a trace of fierceness. He pointed at the little fellow and said angrily, "Who is she?" In fact, did he still need to ask? So no one answered his question. Xianxia held Qin Ruing's hand. He felt that Yingying's hand was a little cold. So he gently squeezed her hand, indicating that she should not be afraid. Although encouraged by Xianxia, Qin Ruing still did not dare to look at the old man directly. She lowered her head slightly and bit her lips tightly. She seemed to be a little scared. After the old man finished asking, he kept staring at Qin Ruing. However, Qin Ruing did not dare to look at him at all. This also made the old man so angry that his beard trembled. When he pointed at Qin Ruing and was about to scold her, Xianxia suddenly turned to the big cat and said, "Big cat, get the carriage, let's go home." His voice was as loud as a bell and as loud as thunder. The big cat heard the voice and got up. It immediately jumped to Xianxia's side and its body expanded rapidly. The deep cloud ink leopard showed its fangs. This sudden change also startled the old man, and a trace of surprise appeared on his face. He looked at the big cat and said with some surprise, "Monster?" The big cat suddenly changed back to its original form, and many people at the gate of the yard were frightened. Some people even immediately left the yard. However, the old man was only stunned for a moment. Then he suddenly burst out laughing. Our village has never had a mountain guardian spirit beast. This old man has been traveling for more than 10 years but still couldn't find one. I didn't expect that today I would find it so easily. The big cat crouched beside Xianxi's feet and assumed a pouncing posture. This old man made it very unhappy, so it immediately roared at the old man, "Meow." The old man laughed and took a step forward. But at this time, a figure suddenly flew over from the mountain. After a few twists and turns, the figure suddenly appeared in the open space in the center of the courtyard. This was a middle-aged man who looked to be in his 40s. His temperament was refined and he had a scholarly air about him. Third uncle. After the man arrived, he respectfully bowed to the old man. The old man glanced at him with some displeasure, but he still stopped. He flicked his sleeve and scolded, "Look at your good daughter." Hearing this, the middle-aged man slowly turned around and looked at Xianxi. After seeing him turn around, Qin Ruiying couldn't help but shout nervously, "Dad?" The man was Qin Yongyan. Qin Yongyan silently looked at Qin Ruiying and then looked at Xianxi. Finally, his eyes fell on the little fellow in Xianxi's arms. The little fellow was lying in Xianxi's arms. Seeing Qin Yongyan looking at her, the little fellow was embarrassed and hid her little face in Xianxi's arms. There were too many people here and the little fellow had learned to be afraid of strangers. Qin Yongyan was silent for a long time. Then he sighed deeply, looked at Qin Ruiying with a complicated expression and asked softly, "Ying, is this your child? How old is she?" Qin Ruiying didn't speak. Xianxi smiled and said, 4.5 years old. She will be 5 years old in summer. Qin Yongyan couldn't help shaking his head when he heard this. He seemed to be deeply moved as he sighed faintly, "So I'm already a grandfather." The grandfather and granddaughter met for the first time under such circumstances. The old man called third uncle was obviously not interested in seeing their family reunion, so he shouted again, "Qin Yongyan, let me ask you, Xian Nu had an affair with another man and gave birth to a bastard child. According to the ancestral rules, how should we punish her?" Qin Yongyan was stunned. He didn't turn around. Instead, he looked at Qin Ruiying and said in a low voice with a pained expression, "Fire." "Then why are you still standing there? Take them down." Qin Yongyan stood there with a complicated expression on his face. Qin Ruiying couldn't help crying when she saw him like this. She murmured sadly, "Dad, I'm sorry." As she spoke, she wanted to break free from Xianxi's hand and rush over. However, Xianxi held her tightly, ready to see Qin Yongyan's reaction. Although the person in front of him was his father-in-law. However, if he wanted to push Ying into the fire pit, then don't blame Xianxi for being ruthless. Qin Yongyan didn't respond. Third uncle waited for a while, but he still didn't move. He was so angry that he laughed and said, "What? You can't do it?" Qin Yongyan still didn't answer. Third uncle was furious when he saw this. He immediately shouted to the crowd behind him, "Xinghua Hian, take down this adulterous couple and that bastard child." As soon as he finished speaking, 2 figures suddenly rushed out from the crowd. "Old Qin, third uncle has given the order. Sorry to offend you." Zhao Xinghua, Li Hoan and Qin Yongyan. The 3 of them were the best of their generation and it was hard to tell who was the better one. The stranger in front of them was obviously Qin Yongyan's son-in-law, and the girl was his granddaughter. Zhao Xinghua and Li Hin were not willing to participate in these trivial matters, but under the old man's orders, they had no choice but to act and capture this stranger who had suddenly intruded. The 2 of them jumped out of the crowd and went straight to Xianxi. However, Qin Yongyan suddenly turned around and stood in front of them. Then he directly hit Zhao Xinghuai's back with his palm. "Old Qin, you." Zhao Xinghua didn't expect that Qin Yongyan would dare to attack him in this situation. He was caught off guard and had to take the hit. Li Hoan saw this and immediately supported Zhao Xinghua. Then he started to fight with Qin Yongyan. The 3 of them were suddenly in a mess. Xianxi saw this and immediately said to the big cat, "Big cat, go and help him." Meow. The big cat joined the fight. Li Hoan was forced to turn around and fight, which immediately relieved the pressure on Qin Yongyan. The big cat was a monster in the awakening realm, which was equivalent to the foundation establishment stage of cultivators. However, Li Hoan could fight with the big cat without being at a disadvantage. This also allowed Xianxi to have the most direct judgment of their strength. Third uncle looked at the 3 of them with a gloomy face, but he didn't say anything to stop them. At this time, Xianxia suddenly let go of Qin Ruiying's hand. He gently pinched the little girl's face, and then very gently handed the little girl to Qin Ruiying. The little girl was still a little unfamiliar with her mother, so she immediately grabbed Xianxia and asked nervously, "Papa, what are you going to do?" "Papa is going to reason with them." "Good girl, you go to Mama." "Oh." The little girl nodded blankly. It was unknown whether she understood or not. Looking at the three of them suddenly fighting in front of her, the little girl thought that they were dancing. She tilted her head and thought for a while. She opened her mouth and was about to say something. However, Xianxia suddenly used a meditation spell on the little girl's forehead. The little girl fell into a deep sleep. "Good girl, go to sleep. When you wake up we will be home." Xianxia gently touched her little face and then touched Qin Ruiying's face. Qin Ruiying held his hand and her face was full of worry. But at this time Xianxia said to her with a smile, "I'll take you home." Qin Ruiying was stunned. "Yes." She nodded heavily and hugged the little guy in her arms even tighter. Xianxia took back his hand, turned around and took a step forward. Behind him was his wife and child, and his sister-in-law who couldn't speak or move and could only be anxious. In front of him, it was a group of strangers led by the old man. The old man looked at him and was about to ask someone to take him down. Xianxia suddenly opened his mouth and said two words softly. "Sir, come." He raised his right hand and grasped in the air. The wind and snow all over the sky seemed to hear his call. Like a dragon dancing, the wind and snow came with great momentum. The snow floated to Xianxia's hand and instantly condensed into ice. In the blink of an eye, a 3-foot-long sword condensed by ice appeared in his hand. With the sound of a sword, the wind and snow came. "I stand with a sword. With frost and snow as my sword, I dare to be the enemy of the world. I give you quality and you give me support and understanding, okay?" Chapter 111. A sword rang out. A long sword made of frost and snow appeared in Xianxia's hand. The blade was as thin as a cicada's wing. It could take a life with a light stroke. However, the sword was made of ice. In terms of hardness, it was not even comparable to glass. It could shatter into pieces with a casual touch. However, when the sword appeared, Third Uncle's expression changed abruptly. His old face was filled with shock. "Divine arts. You've already stepped into the heavenly master realm at such a young age." A martial artist who sat on his crotch was called a grandmaster. A necromancer who had divine arts was called a heavenly master. Both of them were titles, but the meaning they represented was completely different from one another. The great Tao was like mercury flowing down the ground. No matter which path one took, they would reach the same end in the end. Therefore, if the two were compared, a heavenly master was in existence 2 whole realms higher than a grandmaster. Third Uncle sized up Xianxia with surprise and uncertainty. No matter how he looked at him, this man was about the same age as Qin Ruiying. However, he was actually an illuminating god necromancer. Third Uncle was still in shock and uncertainty. However, Xianxia took another step forward and shouted coldly, "Who's coming? Who's coming? Who dares to come?" He stood proudly with his sword. With frost and snow as his sword, his aura suddenly rose. It was as if an ordinary young man had suddenly become a peerless swordsman who looked down on the world. A cyclone suddenly appeared in the sky above the courtyard. The wind and snow were also expelled from the courtyard by that invisible cyclone. Even the snow stopped falling in this courtyard. The martial Tao was about aura. When facing an enemy, if you lost your aura, you had already lost by 3 points. Xianxia's aura was so strong that it was overbearing. Third Uncle, on the other hand, couldn't figure out his background. However, the old man was very cunning. Since he could not figure out his background, he immediately looked behind him. He did not say anything. A middle-aged man immediately walked out. This middle-aged man was muscular and only wore a single shirt in the middle of winter. After walking out of the crowd, he spat on the ground and said disdainfully, "How dare you be so impudent here, you?" However, before he could finish his sentence, Xianxia interrupted him. Without even looking at the man, he coldly said, "You're not worthy." The man was taken aback. He was so angry that his entire face was distorted. But at this time, Xianxia suddenly waved his arm, and an invisible force suddenly shot out. The man immediately spat out a mouthful of blood and was sent flying. "Zhao Laosi, are you okay?" If the person behind him hadn't caught him in time, he would have fallen heavily to the ground. Zhao Laosi kept spitting out blood and couldn't say a word. From the looks of it, he must have suffered severe internal injuries. Take him to Miracle Dr. Wang. Third uncle only glanced at Zhao Laosi, then turned his head to look at Xianxia. At this moment his expression finally became serious. Who's next? Xianxia took another step forward and said coldly. Although his words were directed at everyone in the courtyard, his gaze was on third uncle. Under normal circumstances, Xianxia wouldn't use a sword. The reason why he took the sword before the battle today was to seize the opportunity for himself. This old man wasn't simple. This village was full of hidden dragons and crouching tigers. Xianxia was proud but not arrogant. Those below the Golden Core realm were ants. But if a few Golden Core realm cultivators really appeared, it would be troublesome. After all, he was still severely injured and had yet to recover. Moreover, his wife and children were here. Once he struck, he would kill until they were terrified. Xianxia held his sword and walked slowly in the direction of the courtyard. Some of the weaker cultivators immediately ran out of the courtyard when they saw that the situation wasn't good. Young man, you're so spirited. Third uncle finally spoke. He chuckled and looked at Xianxia thoughtfully. Then he shook his head and sighed. Fine, let this old man fight you. As soon as he finished speaking, third uncle suddenly attacked. Energy surged all over his body and he suddenly slapped his palm toward Xianxia. His palm was like a rainbow piercing through the sun, aiming directly at Xianxia's head. Third uncle's action was no different from a sneak attack, which was despised by others. The reason why he did this was because he wasn't completely confident that he could defeat Xianxia. It could only be said that Xianxia's performance was too strong, so he didn't dare to be arrogant in front of Xianxia. Xianxia, watch out. Just as third uncle attacked, Qin Xueqing, who had been released by Xianxia, suddenly shouted, Third uncle has already cultivated the supreme force. He's above the master realm. However, third uncle's movements were extremely fast. As soon as she spoke, third uncle had already slapped toward Xianxia's head. He chose a very clever position. He was standing in front and left of Xianxia. Xianxia was holding a sword in his right hand, and his left side was wide open, full of flaws. Looking at Xianxia, who was so close to him, a cold light flashed in third uncle's eyes. He could even imagine what kind of scene would occur after this palm strike. A Daoist master? Within 10 steps I'll kill you like killing a chicken. Third uncle's eyes flashed with a trace of fierceness. He was not a kind man. So after this attack he didn't think of holding back at all. But at this moment, Xianxia suddenly disappeared in front of him. Third uncle was stunned and could no longer maintain his calmness. His expression changed greatly. Like an old crane flapping its wings, he immediately tried to escape. However, how could Xianxia let him go? His sword moved according to his will, and the long sword made of frost and snow suddenly pierced third uncle's chest. The first move of the moonlight sword technique. One move, hidden void. Before the sword was out, the sword chi returned to one, hidden and not released. As soon as the sword momentum was released, in an instant, it was like a long river hanging upside down, soaring into the sky. The tip of the sword first pierced through third uncle's protective shield, which could only be condensed by a martial artist in the Gang realm. The so-called impenetrable protective shield was like a glass cover at this moment, and was immediately pierced by Xianxia's sword tip. In the blink of an eye, it turned into white gas and dissipated in all directions. Third uncle retreated quickly. He was even faster than when he came, and in the blink of an eye, he had already rushed out of the courtyard. This person was too terrifying. Unfortunately, that sword was even faster. One move, hidden void. As soon as the sword move was released, it would return after drinking blood. Third uncle was still in midair, but Xianxia's sword seemed to turn into a ray of light, directly shooting toward third uncle's back. Puff. The sword chi went straight into third uncle's flesh, and his body exploded into a cloud of blood. Then, like a wild goose that was shot by a hunter, he fell heavily to the bottom of the hill. There was a dead silence. Even Qin Ruiying was frightened by Xianxia's killing intent, and could not help but reach out to grab his clothes. No wonder he wanted Nian Yin to sleep. It turned out that he was going to kill third uncle. A few of the smarter ones immediately reacted, shouting third uncle's name, and rushed out to look for him. This change came too suddenly. The two people who were fighting Qin Yongyan and Big Cat immediately jumped out of the battle and retreated directly to the courtyard door. Big Cat wanted to chase after them, but Xianxia stopped him in time. Big Cat, come back. Meow. Qin Yongyan stared at his cheap son-in-law in front of him, dumbfounded. That was third uncle. And Gang Realm great-grandmaster. He could not even take one move of his sword. She did not notice his father-in-law's expression. Chapter 112. In fact, she didn't want to kill them all. He wanted to kill them until they were terrified. What bullsh asterisk t ancestral behest? What bullsh asterisk t? Burning Yingying with a gun? Then I'll burn all of you first. At this moment, the murderous look in Qinshi's eyes was enough to make people retreat 3 feet away. After he hit third uncle with his sword, the group of people in the courtyard who were watching the show all left the courtyard. They came quickly and retreated even faster. Qinshi didn't stop at all. He took another step forward and shouted coldly, "Who else?" He glanced at everyone who dared to show their faces. Everyone who made eye contact with him would quickly look away. They didn't dare to look at him for more than a second. Even Zhao Xinghuai and Li Hoan, who were fighting with Qin Yongyan, had retreated to the entrance of the courtyard. They guarded the entrance nervously. Third uncle couldn't even take one move from him. No one dared to stand up. Qinshi waited for a while. Seeing that they were all afraid, he held Yingying's hand again and said gently to her, "Let's go home." For simple words. However, it made Qin Ruoying cry again at this moment. She looked at the strange yet familiar man in front of her. A sense of security instantly filled her heart. 20 years ago, that subconscious choice. That's right. She held the sword in one hand and Yingying in the other. He was going to take her home. On their way home, he would kill anyone who stood in his way. He would kill anyone who stood in his way. However, just as Qinshi's aura was at its peak, an old voice suddenly came from the sky. Yes, it came from the sky. "Young man, since you're already a heavenly master, why are you so angry? I've seen a heavenly master before." His temperament was also impressive. This voice seemed to be everywhere, penetrating every nook and cranny. After hearing this voice, the people outside the courtyard were shocked. They kept turning their heads to look for the source of the voice. Hearing this, Qinshi couldn't help but snort angrily. He gently squeezed Yingying's soft hand, then let go of her hand. "Stop pretending to be mysterious. Kill the young and the old will come." Qinshi took another step forward and protected Yingying behind him. Then he raised his head slightly and looked in the direction of the ancestral hall. Then Qinshi suddenly looked up to the sky and roared, "Since you want to fight, come out. Come at me together so that I don't waste my time." In that instant, his voice was like the roar of a lion, exploding with thunder. The people outside the courtyard were so shocked that their ears were ringing. They couldn't help but cover their ears. Some of them couldn't stand it and immediately squatted on the ground and screamed in pain. However, the Qin's family in the courtyard didn't feel anything. Qin Wanqing even found it strange. What was wrong with the people outside the courtyard? A burst of laughter suddenly sounded. The person hadn't arrived yet, but his appearance could already be heard from his voice. He was like an old and kind grandfather looking at his naughty grandson. His eyes were full of a kind and doting feeling. "Young man, you're so arrogant." As soon as he finished speaking, a figure suddenly appeared in the sky above the ancestral hall. It was an old man in white training clothes. He looked old and clumsy, leaning on an elm walking stick. He slowly walked in the direction of the courtyard. As he was walking. However, he was walking in the air at an altitude of 40 to 50 meters. That's great-granduncle. Zhao Xinghuai stared at the old man in a daze. After rubbing his eyes hard, he suddenly knelt down and shouted, "Greetings to great-granduncle." As soon as he said that, everyone outside the courtyard knelt on the ground and shouted, "Greetings to great-granduncle." Great-granduncle was the village's legend. No one knew exactly how old great-granduncle was, and no one knew exactly how high his seniority was. That was why even third uncle could only call him great-granduncle. Great-granduncle hadn't appeared for decades, so many people thought that he had passed away. They didn't expect to see great-granduncle again today. Qinshi's brows furrowed slightly. He felt very uncomfortable. Because he couldn't stand this kind of old bastard who was still unwilling to turn into dust despite the decadent feudal tradition. "I don't care what Elysium or Xianyu you are. If you want to burn Yingying to death, then you're going against me." Thinking of this, Qinshi couldn't help but snort angrily. Then he picked up his sword and walked towards the old man step by step. It was as if he was playing in Mount Tai. With every step Qinshi took, it was as if he was stepping on a new level. However, there was nothing under his feet. He was walking in the air. He was ascending to the sky. Grand Elder Gongjing greeted the juniors outside the courtyard with a smile. When he saw Xianxia walking in the air from the courtyard, the kind smile on his face slowly disappeared. Celestial being? Great-granduncle leaned on his walking stick and couldn't help but ask in surprise, "You've already become a celestial being?" Above the celestial master level was the condensing pill. Only after the condensing pill could one become a celestial being. Xianxia walked in the air and stood in front of great-granduncle. One was old and one was young. One was holding a sword and the other was leaning on a walking stick. They just stood in the air. Xianxia acted as if he didn't hear great-granduncle's exclamation. Instead he asked, "I only have one question." Great-granduncle took a deep look at him, then laughed and said, "Please go ahead." Xianxia's current state had forced him to put this young man in the same position as himself. Hearing this, Xianxia suddenly laughed. "You beat the young one and the old one comes. Why don't you come together? Do you have anyone above you? If you do, just call them out. I'm in a hurry." After that, Xianxia stood with his hands behind his back and the tip of his sword slanted. Frost and snow as a sword. Shining brightly. Great-granduncle didn't say anything. At this moment his eyes became a little gloomy. Since third uncle came in, Xianxia's momentum had been rising. Before the fight, great-granduncle already had a trace of fear in his heart. That was momentum. Winning with momentum, winning before the fight. This young man was really terrifying. Great-granduncle looked at Xianxia expressionlessly as if he was thinking about something. After thinking for a while he suddenly chuckled. "Young man, it's good to have spirit. But have you ever thought that if you lose today, even if you only lose by one move, what will happen to you, your wife and your children?" How vicious this old bastard was. After hearing this, even with Xianxia's self-confidence and composure, he couldn't help but look back at his wife and children in the courtyard. Almost without any hesitation he raised his left hand and grabbed in the air. The wind and snow suddenly became stronger. In just a moment hundreds of frost swords condensed around him. Xianxia waved his left hand. The densely packed frost swords suddenly flew towards Qin Ruiying, who was in the courtyard. Buzz. The long swords broke through the ground, bringing with them a burst of crisp sounds. With Qin Ruiying as the center, the dense frost swords were inserted into the ground one after another. Chapter 113. Frost and snow were the swords and the swords were the array. Hundreds of frost swords were densely inserted into the ground, surrounding Qin Ruiying, who was holding the little fellow. If one looked from the sky, one would find that these swords were not randomly inserted. The position of each frost sword contained a certain truth of heaven and earth. Qin Yongyan was his father-in-law, and Qin Xueqing was his sister-in-law. These were all people closely related to Yingying, so Xianxia conveniently included them. In this big village, Yingying seemed to have only 2 relatives left. Setting up an array required distraction. And this was actually the real purpose of great-granduncle. Would he really be so kind as to remind Xianxia to protect his wife and child? Obviously not. Great-granduncle was just breaking Xianxia's momentum. He grasped the lifeline and broke the momentum with one word. Even a snake should be hit where it hurts, let alone a person. In great-granduncle's eyes, Xianxia came leisurely in the sky with a shocking sword momentum. Xianxia's own momentum had reached the realm of perfection. Just like Shimen Chueshue on the top of the Forbidden City, one man with one sword, his momentum was natural. But Xianxia was not Shimen Chueshue after all. He was more like Yi Guqing with a fatal weakness. That was Yingying and Yanyan. Great-granduncle cleverly grasped Xianxia's weakness. So he broke his momentum. Great-granduncle couldn't figure out Xianxia's realm. But that was not important. If the winner could be decided only by the realm, then what was the point of fighting? They could just compete with whose realm was higher. A lion would use all its strength to hunt a rabbit. If a warrior at the peak of obvious strength used the right method, he might be able to kill a warrior at peak strength. That was martial arts. In a battle between masters, the winner could be seen in an instant. So when Xianxia was distracted to set up a defensive array for Qin Ruiying, great-granduncle took action. He suddenly grabbed his walking stick and swung it at Xianxia. This dragon-headed walking stick was his weapon. With the support of grand-uncle's strength, the dragon head at the top of the crutch seemed to come alive. It was like a dormant black dragon had suddenly woken up. Wrapped in a streak of white light, it suddenly blasted toward Xianxia with shocking power. Hibernating dragon roaring thousand mountains. The clouds in the 8 directions moved and the 4 directions surrendered. Grand Uncle's sneak attack was very sudden. Xianxia had turned around to set up the formation and had not yet turned around. He struck out with his staff, aiming at the back of Xianxia's head. It was no different from Third Uncle's previous behavior. However, he was a little smarter than Third Uncle. He knew that he had to break the momentum and cause his opponent's mind to be disturbed before he made his move. However, no matter how astute Great-Granduncle was, he was still wrong about one thing. That was, he had underestimated Xianxia's strength. It was not an overestimation but a far underestimation. The obvious strength stage could indeed kill the transforming strength stage. However, it was impossible for a golden core cultivator to kill a semi-god realm warrior. Even if he was just a semi-god realm warrior who had not recovered from a serious injury. Therefore, just as the dragon-headed walking stick was about to hit Xianxia, a long sword suddenly appeared in front of Grand Uncle. Ding! The frost sword went from bottom to top. The seemingly fragile blade blocked Grand Uncle's dragon-headed walking stick. Because they were too close, Grand Uncle could even see every fine line on the frost sword. He widened his eyes. The energy in his body was surging and his sleeves were fluttering. Just a little bit more. He would be able to break this frost sword soon. However, no matter how hard Grand Uncle tried, the frost sword was like a pillar holding up the sky between him and Xianxia. At this time, Xianxia had finally finished setting up the formation. With the infusion of true essence, the blade of the frost sword suddenly burst out a strong golden light. He turned to look at Grand Uncle. Since you are tired of living, I'll send you on your way. As soon as he finished speaking, Grand Uncle was shocked. He suddenly realized that a huge threat was coming. Seeing this, Grand Uncle immediately withdrew his dragon-headed walking stick and then struck a pose. The dragon tail was entrenched, the dragon head was raised to the sky, and he held the walking stick in front of him with both hands. The guard technique, coiling dragon in the abyss, motionless as a mountain. And the moment he struck the pose, the tip of the sword condensed by frost and snow also stabbed toward him. A sword hidden in the air. Why did Xianxia use a sword? That was because the true essence he had accumulated was still too little. Could even be said that it was pitiful. He was like a professional landlord who had 10 million in cash but chose to buy a house with all of it. After that, he lived by collecting rent, and he was just a beginner. Therefore, he had to be careful with his spending. He had to be calculative even when buying groceries. He didn't look like a multimillionaire at all. Save money, buy a house, collect rent, save money, buy another house, collect more rent. This was a qualified professional landlord. The Moonlight Sword technique was comparable to the 49 styles of heaven divination. Although it didn't have many moves and had many limitations, it had an advantage that the 49 styles of heaven divination couldn't compare to. That was, the sword technique consumed less true essence. And this was the fundamental reason why Grand Uncle could still jump in front of Xianxia until now. The long rainbow spirit, a sword hidden in the air. The sword light turned into a golden light and instantly blasted toward Grand Uncle. This sword was coming menacingly. Grand Uncle immediately clenched the dragon staff with both hands and roared, "Rise!" His words were the law. A black coiling dragon seemed to be substantial. It transformed into a roar and was about to pounce. Entering the Tao with martial arts, comprehending the truth of heaven and earth, and integrating the spiritual energy of heaven and earth. Grand Uncle was actually a rare peerless master in the world to have practiced martial arts to this level. But it was a pity. The person he met today was Xianxia. A person who belonged to this world but also didn't belong to this world. Therefore, when the golden light hit the black dragon was immediately shaken to the point of almost falling. At the critical moment, Grand Uncle roared angrily. The primordial chi around him suddenly soared. This also made the black dragon, which should have been on the verge of falling, actually take shape again. He actually took the sword head-on. Xianxia looked at him with some surprise, but his hand movements didn't stop. Since he took one sword, let's take another. Oh, it should be 100 swords. The second move of the Moonlight Sword technique. 100 swords, no end. Xianxia raised his long sword and pointed at Grand Uncle from afar. A gust of cold wind that almost made people unable to open their eyes suddenly blew. In the wind and snow all over the sky, 100 frost swords condensed and took shape beside Xianxia one after another. Although the number wasn't as many as when he set up the array just now, each sword faintly glowed with golden light. 100 swords floated in the air as if to illuminate the whole world. The man stood in the air without any emotion in his eyes. This was the last scene that great-granduncle would see in his life. No. Golden light bloomed. It was enough to wipe out some of the darkness in the world. After the 100 swords flew out, Xianxia turned around and flew back to the courtyard. He let go of the frost sword in his hand gently. The invincible divine sword turned back into the snowflakes all over the sky, sprinkling toward this small ancient village. Xianxia landed slowly by the side of Qin Ruing. He reached out his hand and caressed her pretty face, which was a bit cold due to the wind and snow. He then took her hand slowly and said to her gently, "Let's go home." The initial subscriptions of this book have reached 13,000 so far. It will soon surpass The Path Toward Heaven, and catch up with Mu Shen. Thank you, I love you. Chapter 114. The little fellow had a very, very long dream. In that dream there were wonderful magical castles, lively and cute cartoon dolls, and colorful and brilliant magic. It was a very, very long dream. She wanted to ride the roller coaster, but Papa didn't take her. Sister Chang'e was the best. It was Sister Chang'e who took her to ride the roller coaster. There were many people riding the roller coaster. The little fellow had ridden it with Sister Chang'e several times, but she still hadn't gotten tired of it. Where's Papa? The little fellow suddenly thought of Papa, so she sat on the roller coaster and looked around for Papa. Nian. Daddy is here. The little fellow looked in the direction of the voice and suddenly saw her father flying in the sky and greeting her. Papa. She immediately jumped up excitedly and threw herself into her father's arms. Daddy will take you to the sky to pick the stars, okay? Okay. She sat in her father's arms and looked at the roller coaster below her getting smaller and smaller. It flew higher and higher, but she didn't feel afraid at all. Suddenly, a white cloud floated in front of the little fellow's eyes. She pulled off a piece and held it high in her hand. She looked at her father and asked, "Papa, is this a cloud? Just try it. Is it delicious?" Hearing this, the little fellow immediately took the white cloud and took a bite. The sweet taste immediately made her smile until her eyes narrowed. Delicious. Papa, eat it. Nian is so obedient. Delicious. The father and daughter ate the cloud. Suddenly, she woke up from the dream. The light was a little dazzling. The little fellow closed her eyes tightly and moaned for a long time before she finally opened her eyes. Nian, you're awake? A woman's voice came into her ears. The little fellow sat up with the help of the woman, with a confused expression on her face. She rubbed her eyes and glanced at the woman. Then she suddenly burst into tears with a wah. Papa. Qin Ruing was stunned. Seeing this, Xianxia immediately walked over from the side. He gently hugged the little fellow in his arms and kept comforting her. Daddy is here, Daddy is here. Hearing that familiar voice, the little fellow slowly stopped crying. She pouted and hugged Xianxia tightly. It was as if he had been greatly wronged. After comforting her for a while, Xianxia saw that she was no longer crying. He picked her up and said with a smile, "Let's go. Daddy will take you to wash your face." The little fellow lay on top of Xianxia, staring blankly at Qin Ruing with red eyes. Qin Ruing was also looking at her. However, the expression on Qin Ruing's face was very sad. When she saw Xianxia pick up the little fellow from the bed, she immediately stood up from the chair and walked to the side to make way for Xianxia. When Xianxia saw her sad expression, he immediately reached out and patted her arm. He smiled and comforted her. "Give the child some time, okay?" Qin Ruing nodded and forcibly swallowed back the tears that had already welled up in her eyes. Xianxia took the little fellow to the bathroom. She also wanted to follow and see how Xianxia washed the little fellow. But as soon as she took a step, she immediately stepped back. There was the sound of running water in the bathroom. The little fellow bit the toothbrush and said something to Xianxia in a muffled voice. All of a sudden Xianxia laughed. Qin Ruing really wanted to hear what they were talking about, so after hesitating for a moment, she quietly leaned toward the bathroom. However, she was neither a cultivator nor a necromancer. She was not even a martial artist. So no matter how hard she tried, she could not hear what the little fellow was saying. The sound of running water stopped abruptly. Qin Ruing hurriedly returned to the original place as if she had never moved. After washing up, the little fellow finally woke up. Xianxia took her out of the bathroom and went directly to Qin Ruing. "Nian, Daddy is going to cook. Mommy will play with you, okay?" Hearing this, the little fellow could not help but hesitate. She looked up at Xianxia and then at Qin Ruing. After serious consideration, she nodded gently and said very obediently, "Okay. Good girl. Go let mommy watch cartoons with you." With that, Xianxia pinched her little face and then handed her hand to Qin Ruing. Qin Ruing seemed to have not recovered yet. Seeing this, Xianxia smiled gently and said, "Ying watch cartoons with her for a while." After that, Xianxia held the little fellow in one hand and Qin Ruing in the other. After putting the mother and daughter's hands together, he said with a smile, "Daddy is going to cook. I'll call you when it's ready." The first sentence was said to the little fellow, but the second sentence was said to Qin Ruing. After that, Xianxia winked at Qin Ruing. Everything was understood without words. The mother and daughter watched Xianxia walk out of the west wing. After he gently closed the door, Qin Ruing, like a puppet with a spring wound, asked the little fellow tentatively, "Nian, Mommy, can I hold you?" The little fellow nodded, raised her little hand and said sweetly, "Mommy, hold me." Hearing this, Qin Ruing suddenly looked a little excited. She quickly squatted down and gently took the little fellow into her arms. Then she held the little fellow's butt and picked her up. It was different from the excitement of reunion. At this moment, Qin Ruing's heart was only filled with joy. Joy from the bottom of her heart. She was so happy that she couldn't help crying. "Nian, what cartoon do you want to watch? Mommy will find it for you." It seemed that she didn't want the child to see her crying. So after Qin Ruing put the little fellow on the bed, she immediately turned around to look for the remote control. While looking for the remote control, she secretly wiped the tears off her face. Qin Ruing pretended to look for the remote control. The little fellow waited for a while and seemed to be a little impatient, so she lay on the bed and looked for it herself. Sure enough, the remote control was lying quietly on the bedside table. She picked up the remote control and immediately giggled, "Here it is. Here it is." As she spoke, she skillfully pressed the button to turn on the TV. The channel was a children's channel and it was playing her favorite cartoon. So she immediately turned to the other corner of the room and shouted, Big cat, come on, let's watch the cartoon." She didn't know where the big cat was hiding just now. But after hearing the little fellow's call, it immediately came out, turned into a black shadow and drilled into the little fellow's arms and obediently watched the cartoon with her. Qin Ruing turned around and looked at her daughter who was holding the remote control and holding the big cat in her arms. For a moment she didn't know what to do. The little fellow waited for a while. Seeing that she was still in a daze, she immediately shouted to her, "Mommy, sit here." As she spoke, she patted the quilt beside her. Qin Ruing sat on the edge of the bed, but the little fellow seemed to be a little dissatisfied, so she immediately pouted and said, "Mommy wants to sit here." Hearing that, Qin Ruing immediately took off her shoes and sat beside the little fellow. After seeing that she sat down, the little fellow nodded in satisfaction, then directly raised her arm and drilled into her arms like a cat. "Mommy, watch the cartoon with me." "Mommy will watch it with you." Outside the house. After hearing the conversation between the mother and daughter, Xianxia couldn't help but smile slightly. After laughing for a while, he felt relieved and walked to the kitchen. Chapter 115. The courtyard of the Qin family suddenly became lively. There were not many dishes at home, so Xianxia went to the supermarket first and then went straight to the kitchen with bags of food. In this family, only he and Yin were outsiders. It was also because of these two outsiders that the atmosphere in the house became a little strange. Qin Ruing and the little fellow were watching cartoons in the west wing, Qin Xueqing was making a phone call in the east wing, and Qin Yongyan was alone in the study next to the main room, doing something unknown. There were more people at home, so the dinner naturally had to be more sumptuous. So when Xianxia returned to the kitchen, he started 3 stoves at the same time. He washed and prepared the vegetables, shredded and peeled them, and cooked the soup and stir-fried the vegetables. He was very busy. After all, he did not have 3 heads and 6 arms, so he simply used the sword controlling technique and the fire controlling technique, preparing to cook this family banquet with the means of immortal cultivators. Yes, family banquet. Xianxia was brought up by his grandfather since he was a child. Unfortunately, his grandfather died early, so he had no relatives in this world for a long time. When he was in college, he finally had a lover. It also made him understand what it meant to care. Now his lover became his family. Therefore her family had become his family. He had a family. It was a kind of relationship that was not related by blood but was comparable to blood. A person who had no family suddenly had a family. So he cherished it more than anyone else. Spiced goose platter, stewed bird's nest with rock sugar, small bowl of golden hook fin, steamed lobster, braised eel, dragon tongue, abalone with snail meat, liaoning ginseng with sauce, steamed crab, steamed eastern star spot, caterpillar fungus stewed with flour glue, 10 dishes. All of which were main dishes. Ying liked to drink vegetable soup, so Xianxia specially made a nourishing vegetable soup for her in winter. Xianxia scooped up a spoonful with an iron spoon and tasted it. Well, it tasted good. As for the little fellow, she was not picky. As long as it was made by her father, she liked to eat it, so it was easier to clean up. Because he didn't know what his father-in-law and sister-in-law liked, Xianxia couldn't cook a dish for them for the time being. Because it was winter, before 6 o'clock in the evening, the sky of Xiangjing was completely covered by the curtain of night. Tens of thousands of lanterns lit up the sky without night, 10 li of beautiful gauze filled with fragrance. The lights in the Qin family's courtyard were also turned on. There were many dishes today, so they could only eat in the main hall. After placing the bowls and chopsticks in order, Xianxia shouted towards the door, "The food is ready. Come and eat first." The little girl heard her father's shouts. Therefore she immediately jumped out of Qin Ruing's arms and stood on the bed, jumping up and down as she said smugly, "Mama. It's time to eat, I'm hungry. I want to eat." "Okay, let's go. Mommy will take you to eat." Qin Ruing carried the little fellow out of the west wing. When he arrived at the main hall, he was immediately shocked by the sumptuous dinner in front of him. "You did it?" She put down the little fellow, then pointed at the big meal in front of her, and couldn't help but ask suspiciously. Xianxia used to cook, but he only knew how to cook a few simple home-cooked dishes. He didn't even think about complicated dishes. Take the table in front of her as an example. Even if Xianxia told her that he bought it outside, she would probably believe him immediately. "How is it? Is my cooking okay? You've improved." Qin Ruing quietly glanced at the little fellow. Seeing that she was only focused on the dishes on the table, she quickly kissed Xianxia on the face. Being rewarded by his wife, Xianxia immediately smiled proudly. He didn't put in so much effort in vain. It was okay. Although they hadn't seen each other for a long time, the tacit understanding between them had become even closer. The two of them stood in front of the main hall and waited for a while. Seeing that the little fellow was a little impatient, they made a move almost at the same time. Without any prior discussion, Qin Ruing pointed to the study on the right and Xianxia pointed to the east wing on the left. Seeing this, Qin Ruing immediately smiled and said, "Telepathy." Xianxia said, "Telepathy." After that, both of them couldn't help laughing. Qin Ruing turned and walked to the study. "I'll call Dad first." After she left, Xianxia touched the little fellow's head and said, "Nian Nian, good girl. Don't steal food. Dad will call Auntie to eat. We'll eat when Grandpa and Auntie arrive." "I won't steal food." The little fellow nodded heavily while chewing the spiced goose. "Naughty." Xianxia gently pinched her little face, which was bulging like a hamster, and walked out of the main hall with a smile. The light in the east wing was on. Qin Xueqing had been hiding in the room since she came home. No one knew what she was doing. Xianxia knocked on the door, but she didn't respond. He couldn't just barge into his sister-in-law's room. Therefore Xianxia waited outside for a while and shouted outside the door, "It's time to eat." He didn't call her that, because he really hadn't thought about how to call his sister-in-law. If he called her by her full name, it would seem too distant. If he called her by her name with his current relationship with his sister-in-law, he was afraid that he would be slapped in the face. Therefore Xianxia thought about it and simply didn't even call her by her name. After waiting for a while, the door opened. Qin Xueqing walked out of the east wing and stood in front of Xianxia. She looked at Xianxia thoughtfully but still didn't say a word. Seeing this, Xianxia smiled and said to her, "It's time to eat." After that he turned and walked to the main hall. He had already said what he wanted. It was up to her whether she wanted to eat or not. Looking at Xianxia's back, Qin Xueqing hesitated for a moment, then suddenly said, "The leader wants to see you. He hopes that you can come with me to the headquarters in Xiangjing." Xianxia didn't turn around as if he didn't hear her. Qin Xueqing was a little anxious and immediately wanted to chase after him. But at this moment, Xianxia suddenly stopped in his tracks. He leaned to the side and glanced back at Qin Wanqing. Then he said coolly, "I can give you face and let him see me." After that he turned and walked into the main hall. Outside the study, Qin Ruoying gently knocked on the door. After waiting for 2 seconds she didn't hear any response, so she pushed the door open and went in. "Dad, it's time to eat." Qin Yongyan sat in the chair and stared at the desk in front of him. No one knew what he was thinking. Qin Ruoying walked to his side. After glancing at the rice paper on the table, she read out the words he wrote on the paper. "The heavenly gate is broken and the Chu River is opened. The blue water flows back to the east. The green mountains on both sides of the river face each other. The lonely sail comes from the horizon." The words were good and the poem was good. After reading, Qin Ruoying gently put her hand on her father's shoulder. After a little hesitation she asked uncertainly, "Dad, are you blaming me?" Qin Yongyan didn't say anything. Qin Ruoying stood behind him silently. The expression on her face became more and more sad. Suddenly, Qin Yongyan let out a deep sigh. Then he crumpled the rice paper on the table into a ball and threw it into the wastebasket next to him. Chapter 116. Family Banquet. Family and Banquet. The whole family sat together to eat. This was called a family banquet. Family banquets were so ordinary that there was nothing special about them. They just needed the whole family to sit together and have a happy meal. Wuxia was very big, so customs may be a little different from place to place. In some places, even the most high-end and expensive restaurant could not be regarded as the highest standard for receiving guests. The real highest standard was to invite the guest to the house for a seemingly ordinary home-cooked meal. Family banquet. She had never eaten a family banquet. The one he had eaten with Yingying before was called a couple's meal. She returned to the main hall and saw the little fellow standing on the chair, quietly eating the dishes on the table. She knew how to use chopsticks, but she didn't like to use them. Usually she ate rice and soup, so she usually used a spoon. She served the main dish today. The little fellow tried a few times and found that she couldn't pick up the dishes, so she simply threw down the chopsticks and grabbed the dishes with her hands. She quietly walked not far from her and coughed softly. Because he was afraid of scaring her, she deliberately lowered his voice. But he didn't expect that such a small voice would startle the little fellow. She immediately threw away the braised goose slice in her hand in a panic. "Papa, I didn't steal it." As she spoke, the little fellow quickly wiped the oil on her mouth. Seeing that her hands and mouth were full of oil, she sat beside her, then took out a tissue and helped her wipe it carefully. As if afraid that her father would be angry, the little fellow immediately pouted and put on a pitiful look. Seeing this, she rubbed her head and said with a smile, "Good girl, eat when you're hungry. It's okay." As he spoke, she stood up and handed her the braised goose leg on the table. The little fellow was a little clever. She knew not to take the biggest and most conspicuous braised goose leg, but only some seemingly inconspicuous braised goose slices. "Papa is so nice." After receiving the braised goose leg, the little fellow was immediately overjoyed. She smiled so widely that flowers were about to bloom on her little face. After taking a big bite, she handed the braised goose back to Big Cat while chewing. She said with a lisp, "Big Cat, come you eat too." Hearing this, the big cat quickly jumped to the little guy's side. After taking a bite, it started to meow. This fellow was a monster that had cultivated successfully, and the spiritual chi of heaven and earth had already washed away the filth on its body, so she didn't mind the little fellow eating with it. She waited for a moment. Seeing that she was happy, he pulled her to his side and looked into her eyes. He said seriously, "Nian Nian, promise me that you won't lie anymore. You can tell me whatever you want. As long as it's reasonable, I'll agree to it. Do you understand?" The little guy was stunned for a moment. After hesitating for a moment, she nodded gently and replied weakly with a pout, "Okay, I won't lie, good girl." She pinched her little face. At this time, Qin Xueqing also walked into the main hall. After seeing her sit down, she turned his head and looked in the direction of the study. To be honest, he still hadn't decided what kind of attitude he should use to face Qin Yongyan. Since ancient times, the relationship between father and son-in-law was slightly better than the relationship between mother and daughter-in-law. But this didn't mean that there wouldn't be conflicts between father and son-in-law. As the saying goes, the more a mother-in-law looks at her son-in-law, the more she likes him. However, there was no uniform way for a father-in-law to look at his son-in-law. Perhaps it was because mature men were more reserved, so they would hide some of their thoughts in their hearts and wouldn't make a conclusion easily. Even if they liked or disliked him, the father-in-law wouldn't easily express it. Before arriving home, Qin Ruiying proposed to eat outside, but Qianxia said that he wanted to let her try his cooking. Qin Ruiying couldn't persuade him, so there was this sumptuous meal in front of her. In fact, eating wasn't the main point. Meeting Yingying's father officially was the main point of this dinner. Qin Shi and Qin Yongyan, this father-in-law and son-in-law, had a very subtle relationship. Yin was already 4 years old when Qin Yongyan just found out that he had a granddaughter. And as his son-in-law, Qin Shi showed his invincible power in the village in the morning, showing his absolute power that was beyond imagination. Everything that happened. What kind of experience would Qin Yongyan have? Qin Shi couldn't imagine it from his perspective. After all, he wasn't involved. Anyway, what's done is done, and he had finished eating. His father-in-law couldn't possibly ask him to spit it out, right? After waiting for a while, Qin Ruiying and Qin Yongyan arrived. As soon as they walked into the main hall, Qin Shi was about to get up and greet them. Like Qin Xueqing, Qin Shi still hadn't figured out how to address Qin Yongyan. Yingying wasn't his legal wife after all. They were already engaged, so it wouldn't be good to call him dad directly. Yin was already 4 years old and she was still calling him grandpa sweetly. But he was calling Qin Yongyan uncle. Wouldn't that seem too distant? How should he address him? It was so annoying. Even an immortal would worry about such trivial matters. While Qin Shi was still worrying, Qin Yongyan's reaction immediately eased Qin Shi's awkwardness. Qin Yongyan followed Qin Ruiying into the main hall. Seeing that Qin Shi was about to get up, he immediately stopped Qin Shi and then said with a smile, "You've worked hard. Sit down." After that, he directly sat down at the head of the table in front of the red sandalwood carving table. After waiting for so long, the children must be hungry. Let's have a taste. Is the master's cooking as good as his swordsmanship? Qin Yongyan said with a smile, but quietly made a small joke with Qin Shi. As soon as he said that, Qin Xueqing's hand, which was about to pick up the chopsticks, suddenly trembled. She was a Wu Dao guru, but now even holding a pair of chopsticks was trembling. It was easy to imagine how complicated her feelings were right now. After all, she wasn't as shrewd and calm as Qin Yongyan. After secretly glancing at Qin Shi, she picked up the chopsticks and directly started to eat. At this time, Qin Shi got up and pushed the small bowl of golden wings to Qin Yongyan, and then said with a smile, "Sorry to make a fool of myself. This small bowl of golden wings is my specialty. Would you like to have a taste?" "Haha, then I won't stand on ceremony. Please." A seemingly ordinary family feast began amidst this harmonious atmosphere. During the banquet, Qin Yongyan kept chatting with Qin Shi about various trivial matters. Qin Ruiying was responsible for serving the little girl. Only Qin Xueqing was restless and felt very awkward. After finishing the rice quickly, she immediately got up and said, "I'm full. Uncle, sister, take your time." After that, Qin Xueqing turned to leave. However, at this time, Qin Yongyan suddenly stopped her and asked with a smile, "Xueqing, did you talk to your father on the phone?" Qin Xueqing nodded and replied, "Yes, they will come back after a while." Qin Yongyan nodded, but then suddenly pointed to her seat and said with a smile, "There are guests at home. You can be considered as half the host here. Don't be in a hurry to leave. Sit down for a while." Qin Xueqing looked at Qin Yongyan with a little surprise. Seeing that he was looking at her with a smile, Qin Xueqing couldn't help but hesitate for a moment, and then reluctantly sat down again. Qin Shi glanced at Qin Xueqing. After seeing her sit down, he suddenly said to Qin Yongyan, "Uncle Qin, sorry for calling you like this." Hearing this, Qin Yongyan immediately turned to look at Qin Shi. He still had a smile on his face. He just looked at Qin Shi with a smile and didn't say anything. Seeing this, Qin Shi also smiled. He gently held Qin Ruiying's hand under the table and then said with a smile, "Yin is already 4 years old, but I still owe Yingying a romantic wedding. So, I hope to hold this wedding for her under your witness. What do you think? Can you?" Before Qin Yongyan could answer, Qin Ruiying had already turned her head and looked at Qin Shi in a daze. Wedding. She really never thought about it. Qin Shi had actually been keeping this matter in her heart. Drinking wine and growing old together. Chapter 117. Wedding. Qin Ruiying was stunned. That was something she had never dreamed of. Therefore her first reaction was to avoid the trouble. But when she felt the warmth from Qin Shi's hand, after hesitating for a while, She swallowed the words that were about to come out of her mouth. Which girl didn't yearn for love? Which teenager didn't fall in love? 20 years had passed and she was almost 30 years old. Her daughter was already 4 years old. Now that Xianxia suddenly said that he wanted to hold a wedding for her, why did it sound so awkward? It was very embarrassing. Oh? Have you decided when to hold it? As he spoke, Qin Yongyan looked at Qin Ruiying with a faint smile. I can do it anytime, it's up to Yingying. With that, Xianxia turned to look at Qin Ruiying. Me? How would I know? Seeing that her father and husband were looking at her, Qin Ruiying hurriedly lowered her head, looking a little embarrassed. Xianxia was stunned for a moment, then he seemed to have thought of something and couldn't help but laugh. He gently squeezed Qin Ruiying's hand, then said to Qin Yongyan, I was dictatorial, I should have discussed with Yingying first. Hearing this, Qin Yongyan immediately nodded and laughed. Then you have a good discussion, let me know when you are sure. After saying that, he continued to eat his food. His attitude was a little strange. Could it be, father-in-law had already acquiesced to the fact that what was done? So he was mentally prepared in advance? Xianxia thought for a while, then threw this question to the back of his mind. He respected his father-in-law, but he wouldn't let his father-in-law's attitude affect his decision. The only person who could really affect his decision was Yingying. Xianxia glanced at Qin Ruiying. He felt that her palm was a little sweaty, so he couldn't help but gently stroke it. There are thousands of people in the world, but do not seek them for the fleeting clouds. A person is like a rainbow, meeting the top will be known. Treasure it as you go. After dinner, Qin Yongyan went straight to his study. Seeing him leave, Qin Xueqing ran back to her room in the east wing as if she was running away. Seeing this, the couple couldn't help but look at each other and shake their heads. Forget it, let's take it slow. Making a family banquet was actually a very tiring thing. Washing vegetables and cooking was very tiring. After eating, one still had to sweep the floor, mop the dishes and wipe the table. Therefore housewives sometimes had a hard time. As a good man of the new era, Xianxia had the awareness to become a house husband. Therefore, when Qin Ruiying wanted to help him clean up, she was directly pushed out by Xianxia. He asked her to take care of the child and cultivate a good relationship with the little fellow. Shangjing is a city that never sleeps. Hohai Workers' Sports Complex and Sanlitun are all bars, nightclubs and food stalls. Hohai was very lively, but Dongming Alley, which was separated by a lake, was very quiet. This was the taste of old Shangjing. After cleaning up, when Xianxia returned to the west wing, the little fellow was lying in Qin Ruiying's arms, giggling in front of the TV. When the little fellow saw Xianxia come in, she immediately sat up, patted the bed and shouted, Papa! Papa, come and watch cartoons with me. Okay, Papa and Mama will watch with you. Xianxia got on the bed and with Qin Ruiying one on the left and one on the right, the little girl was sandwiched between them. The little fellow looked to the left and then to the right. This was the first time she had enjoyed this kind of treatment, so she was immediately very excited. Therefore she turned left and hugged Xianxia and then turned right and hugged Qin Ruiying. She tossed and turned on the bed and was so happy that she didn't even want to watch cartoons. Looking at the little fellow who kept rolling on the bed, Xianxia suddenly turned his head and looked at Qin Ruiying. The feeling of tacit understanding came again. Therefore Xianxia let her play for a while. Seeing that she was too tired to turn over, Xianxia gently touched her little face and said seriously, Nian Nian, it's almost time for you to sleep. Hearing this, the little fellow immediately hugged Xianxia's arm, pouted and said coquettishly, I don't want to. I'm not sleepy, I want to play for a while more. She really slept too much today. It was only 9 o'clock, so the little fellow was full of energy and didn't feel sleepy at all. Xianxia helplessly pinched her face and Qin Ruiying secretly laughed. Children are really ignorant. Hindrance. Although he could use magic to make her sleep, Xianxia obviously wasn't in a hurry to do that, so he had to hold her and watch cartoons again. However, the animation on the children's channel was over, but the little fellow still didn't want to sleep. Xianxia had no choice but to order a Frozen movie for her. A Frozen movie lasted more than 90 minutes. When she finished watching, it was finally 12 o'clock. Papa, I'm sleepy. The little fellow raised her little hand and yawned lazily with her mouth open and finally wanted to sleep. Xianxia was afraid of waking her up, so for the first time he didn't take her to brush her teeth and wash her face tonight. The little fellow held her father in one hand and her mother in the other and soon fell asleep. After gently covering her with the quilt, Xianxia patted her forehead with a meditation spell. He sat up and said softly to the big cat who was lying at the end of the bed dozing off, "Big cat, go out and don't come back tonight." Meow. The big cat looked at him inexplicably. However, what responded to it was Xianxia's slightly murderous eyes. Meow. Seeing this, the big cat immediately jumped out. The door was closed, so just as it was about to jump up and open the door, Xianxia had already opened the door for it. The big cat was stunned for a moment, and then rushed out of the west wing at a faster speed. It was not good to stay here for a long time. After the big cat left, Xianxia picked up the little fellow and gently put her aside, then moved to Qin Ruiying's side and lay down. Qin Ruiying was lying on the bed, seeming a little nervous. As soon as Xianxia lay down beside her, she seemed to be stimulated and suddenly sat up from the bed. After hesitating for a moment, Qin Ruiying said with some embarrassment, "Nian Nian is still next to us. She's asleep." "Aya." Qin Ruiying gently swatted away the devil's claws that wanted to play tricks. She bit her red lips and opened her mouth to say something, but Xianxia had already kissed her gently. She turned around to face the flowing snow, climbing onto the bed to hug the beautiful Tsong. Mandarin ducks dancing neck to neck, jadeite encirclement. Eyebrows together bashfully, lips red and warm. Fresh and fragrant, skin smooth and jade-like. Weak and languid wrists so tender and lovable. Beads of sweat, messy green hair. After 1,000 years of happiness, I've heard of 5 nights of poverty. The time to linger is limited, the love is hard to end. It was the beginning of a break. Ying, do you want to try in the sky tomorrow? In the sky? Qin Ruiying was stunned for a moment, but then she shyly spat at him. Bah! How can you think of that, shameless? We're an old married couple, what's there to be shy about? Hearing that, Qin Ruiying pretended to be angry and threatened him, "I'm going to be angry." Seeing that, Xianxia immediately raised his hands to surrender. Okay, I won't say it. Humph. The two of them lingered for a while. Xianxia hugged her and suddenly asked seriously, "Ying, are you looking forward to our wedding?" Qin Ruiying looked at him quietly in the dark and did not answer immediately. She gently leaned her head on Xianxia's chest. Then, with a sense of relief, she suddenly sighed and said, "I didn't dare to think about it before, so I never thought about it." Thank you. Chapter 118. After the couple spent some time together, the date of the wedding was finally set. December 12th. Half a month later. There was no special meaning to it. Xianxia just wanted to do it as soon as possible, so he chose December 12th after thinking about it. 12/12, 122, I wanna love. It felt good and auspicious, so let's do it on that day. Qin Ruiying gave it some thought and let him make the decision. In fact, she didn't have any special ideas, thinking that it just needed to be simple. As long as she could marry Xianxia under the witness of her father, she would have no regrets in this life. However, Xianxia also wanted to hold a romantic wedding for Ying because he had experienced Fong Lei's high-end cruise wedding. Qin Ruiying didn't agree. Not to mention that Xianxia was all alone, even she didn't have many relatives or friends. So even if the wedding was grand, how many guests could they invite to attend the ceremony? It was a make-up wedding anyway, so it was fine to just give her a simple blessing. Xianxia agreed with her with a smile. The next day, when the little girl woke up, the sun was already high in the sky. Xianxia leaned against the bed and looked at her with a smile. The little girl didn't seem to be awake yet. She stretched, squinted at her father next to her, and then rolled on the bed directly into Xianxia's arms to continue to sleep. The couple sat side by side on the bed, quietly looking at the little girl who was sleeping in Xianxia's arms. Suddenly they looked at each other again. Then they both laughed. Maybe this was the happiest thing in the world. These 2 days there would be light snow from time to time. It wasn't heavy, but it was enough to make the snow pile on the ground higher and higher. The weather was good today. After the snow at night, it was sunny during the day. Qin Xueqing might feel that it was not good to eat Xianxia's food for free every day. So when Xianxia went to the kitchen, he found that she had already bought breakfast and put it in the thermal cabinet. His sister-in-law was actually a very domineering person. However, her brother-in-law was stronger than her. She was so domineering that she could no longer raise her head in front of Xianxia. Because the little fellow had gone back to sleep, it was already 9 o'clock in the morning by the time Qin Ruiying took her to wash up and get up for breakfast. Her sister-in-law was a very particular person, so the breakfast she bought was naturally not the porridge and steamed buns from the roadside stalls. He didn't know where she bought these Cantonese morning snacks, but just looking at them was enough to whet his appetite. Because they woke up too late, Qin Xueqing and Qin Yongyan had already eaten, so Qin Shi directly took the breakfast back to the West Wing. The little girl liked barbecued pork buns and shrimps very much. After taking a bite of each dish, the little girl held the roast pork bun in one hand and the shumai prawn in the other. Her mouth was as big as a squirrel stealing pine nuts, but she didn't forget to nod and praise the deliciousness. Perhaps it was because the weather was too cold, so after breakfast the little girl ran to the bed again to watch cartoons. This was a bad habit. So under Qin Shi's strong request, she had to obediently follow Qin Shi to the yard and prepare to build a snowman with her father. However, perhaps it was because Qin Shi had built a super large snowman for her before. Therefore, the little girl didn't want to build anymore after a while because she was afraid of the cold now. Qin Shi was a little speechless, so he had to begin to reflect on whether there was something wrong with his education of his child. He felt that Nian Yan was becoming more and more disobedient now. Especially after Qin Ruiying came back, she often acted coquettishly and wanted to watch cartoons. And the person she acted coquettishly to was not him. It had only been a day, but she was getting closer and closer to her mother. It was probably because Qin Ruiying had just seen her daughter, so she wanted to be obedient to her. If Qin Shi hadn't stopped her, Qin Ruiying would have even taken her back to watch cartoons. She was afraid of the cold and didn't want to stay outside, but when she entered the house she wanted to watch cartoons. This cartoon definitely couldn't be watched. It was not right to be cooped up at home all day, so she had to exercise. So Qin Shi called the big cat. This guy was comfortable in bed last night, but was suddenly driven to the main hall by Qin Shi to be exposed to the cold wind. Now it was still full of resentment. But when Qin Shi called it, it didn't dare to disagree, so after a meow, it ran over obediently. You change back and take Nian Yan to run a few laps in the yard. Meow. The big cat was a little reluctant and tried to protest with a few meows. Protest was invalid, so it could only obediently change back. This trick was effective. When the little girl saw the big cat change back to its original form, she was immediately attracted. Without Qin Shi's reminder, she quickly rushed over and hugged the big cat. The big cat was very cooperative and the little girl sat on it very skillfully. Big cat. Let's go. Go go go. Obviously it was the big cat doing the work, but because the little girl was too excited she kept shouting, so it didn't take long for her to be tired and gasping for breath. Qin Shi stood on the steps outside the West Wing, looked at the little girl running in the yard, and then looked at his lonely wife beside him. Suddenly he felt that he might already be the happiest person in the world. Winner in life. This feeling was really good. Qin Shi looked up at the sky. The wind and snow had just stopped, and the sky in Shangjing was as blue as it was on National Day. Was this the feeling of happiness? After the washing of time, after the lights waned, one would understand the preciousness of dullness. Thinking of this, Qin Shi couldn't help but gently hold Qin Ruiying's hand. He suddenly turned to her and said, "Ying, I suddenly have a new life goal." Life goal? Hearing this, Qin Ruiying looked at him with some doubts. Seeing his serious face, she immediately couldn't help but chuckle and say, "It's broad daylight, don't make trouble." She thought that Qin Shi was going to play a joke on her again. However, Qin Shi looked at her quietly for a few seconds, but suddenly said to her very seriously, "Ying, I love you. If I have to put a time limit on this love, I hope it's..." Speaking of this, he suddenly paused and then solemnly said the time limit he wanted. "Eternal life. I hope you can be by my side forever. Together with me we'll see the end of time." Qin Ruiying was stunned. But then, she threw herself into Qin Shi's arms, just like in the school playground, and took the initiative to raise her head and kiss Qin Shi's mouth. After a long time, the two reluctantly let go of each other. Qin Xueqing stood outside the East Wing, watching them show their love unscrupulously in public, and immediately snorted angrily. At this time the little fellow rode Big Cat to her side. The little fellow raised her little head again and asked sweetly, "Aunt, do you want to play with me?" Qin Xueqing hesitated for a moment. Then she touched her little head and said softly, "No, you have fun with Big Cat." Big Cat, let's play." After watching the little fellow ride Big Cat away, Qin Xueqing hesitated again, and then quickly walked through the yard to the steps outside the West Wing. She raised her head slightly. Chapter 119. The timing of the sister-in-law's request was very strange. Qin Shi had just finished showing off his affection with her sister, and she was asking for guidance. However, her tone was not very polite, as if she felt that asking Xianxia for guidance was a very embarrassing thing. Her stiff attitude made it impossible for others to feel her sincerity. Sister-in-law was arrogant. Xianxia lowered his head and looked at her but did not answer immediately. At this time Qin Ruiying suddenly squeezed his hand slightly, clearly reminding him to answer quickly. Before the husband said anything, the wife had already started to whisper pillow talk. Xianxia smiled and looked at Qin Ruiying. Then, under Qin Xueqing's slightly expectant gaze, he suddenly shook his head and said softly, "No." Qin Xueqing was stunned. Qin Ruiying was also stunned. The two sisters looked at Xianxia in disbelief. They obviously did not expect Xianxia to refuse. Obvious Jing, Inward Jing, Peak Jing, Dan stage, Alcade stage, Invincible stage, Diviner stage. Xianxia was already standing at the peak of this world. Those who had reached the controlled Dan stage were called Grandmasters. But after reaching the Grandmaster stage, Qin Xueqing realized how difficult it was to go further. Xianxia was a diviner. As long as he casually gave her some guidance, it would definitely be a great help to her. Her idea was good, but she really did not expect that Xianxia would refuse her directly in front of her sister. Qin Xueqing became angrier and angrier the more she thought about it. In a fit of anger, she immediately turned around and walked back to the east wing. Qin Ruiying knew her sister's temper, so she immediately pulled Xianxia, wanting to intercede for her sister. However, before she could say anything, Xianxia sighed softly and suddenly stopped Qin Xueqing. "I have never learned martial arts. How do you want me to give you guidance? Why don't you show it to me first?" Hearing this, Qin Xueqing immediately stopped. She was a Wu Dao Grand Master, but now she was asking for guidance from a necromancer. It did seem a little unreasonable. However, Xianxia was ultimately at the celestial being realm. His horizons were definitely not something that ordinary people could compare to. Thus, after thinking for a while, Qin Wanqing turned around and said, "Okay, I'll play it for you first." After saying that, she walked to the center of the courtyard and got into a starting position. The Qin clan's inherited martial art, Mother-Child Soft Palm. The Mother-Child Cotton Palm had a total of 9 forms, and each form had 6 variations. There were a total of 54 forms and each form had a molecular variation. Therefore, the Mother-Child Cotton Palm had a total of 108 forms. In the small courtyard. In a slightly tipsy winter day, Qin Xueqing proudly stands alone, holding her breath. As a Grandmaster of the Dan stage, she had long cultivated the martial Dao from the vocal realm to the silent realm. Suddenly she moved. Her lotus steps moved slightly, and her posture was exquisite beyond compare. Light clouds danced gracefully as her sleeves fluttered in the wind. Suddenly she was as ethereal as a light cloud, and suddenly she was like a magpie startling its nest. A set of Mother-Child Cotton Palm which was soft but firm came out from her hands. It was not like a martial art but more like a dance. As it fluttered and danced, it was like a snow lotus blooming angrily. The little fellow who was riding the big cat and wandering around was attracted by her dance, so she immediately rode the big cat back to Xianxia's side. She looked up and asked, "Papa, is Auntie dancing?" Xianxia bent down and picked her up from the big cat and then asked with a smile, "How is it? Is Auntie dancing well?" "Yes." The little fellow immediately nodded heavily and suddenly said with some expectation, "I also want to learn." Hearing this, Xianxia kissed her little face and laughed. "Auntie is dancing the mortal dance. When you grow up, Papa will teach you the immortal dance and let you become a fairy like Sister Xianxia, okay? Teach me, Papa." The little fellow put her arms around Xianxia's neck and immediately giggled. The 108 moves were soon finished. Qin Xueqing stopped and stood still. She raised her head and looked at Xianxia again with some expectation in her eyes. Xianxia did not speak immediately because after seeing Qin Xueqing's performance, he suddenly remembered the moves that great-granduncle used when fighting with him. It was beyond the scope of martial arts. The environment of the earth was not suitable for cultivation, so martial arts itself was a deformed product under the influence of the environment. This was a dead end. There was no way ahead. However, great-granduncle had obviously found another way. Therefore, after pondering for a while, Xianxia looked at Qin Xueqing and said softly, "That's it. I'll think about it first and give you an answer tomorrow." Qin Xueqing looked at Xianxia with a complicated expression, and then turned back to her room in the east wing. After his sister left, Qin Ruing turned to look at Xianxia and suddenly asked thoughtfully, "You're so powerful now, is it because of that place in your memory?" She had seen Xianxia's memory. Although it was only the first few years, it was enough for her to understand that there was a place called the Heavenly Jade Domain in this world. The people there were very powerful. Xianxia looked at Qin Ruing. Seeing her worried look, he could not help but smile. "It's a very long story. Let's go, I'll tell you slowly." The couple brought the little fellow back to the West Wing. Then Xianxia told Qin Ruing the story that had lasted for 500 years. Heavenly Jade Domain, Immortal Cultivators. Heavenly Domain, Heavenly Yen Sect. Odd Job Disciple, Dawn Divine Lord. Starting from the Heavenly Jade Domain, he entered the Heavenly Yen Sect and became an Odd Job Disciple. In the end, he stood out from countless Odd Job Disciples and became an official disciple of the Divine Sect, officially beginning his path of cultivation. The story was very long and very unbelievable, so Xianxia could only tell the main points. Qin Ruing became more and more confused as she listened. Until she heard Xianxia say that he had lived in the Heavenly Jade Domain for a full 500 years. She could not help but open her mouth and say in shock, 500 years? She originally thought that Xianxia had only gone to a mysterious place like a village to learn cultivation. Only now did she finally understand. Xianxia had gone to another world. A place infinitely far away from Earth. A place where the flow of time was completely different from Earth. It was too unbelievable. Qin Ruing digested it for a long time, but she still could not accept it. What she cared about was not the immortal cultivators, nor the Heavenly Jade Domain. What she cared about was the 500 years that Xianxia said. She had lost Xianxia for 5 years. But Xianxia had lost her for a full 500 years? A person living alone in a completely unfamiliar place for 500 years? And after 500 years, Xianxia still remembered her? After going through so much just to come back and find her? Qin Ruing stared at Xianxia in a daze. She would not doubt his words, which was why she felt that it was somewhat unacceptable. What did 500 years mean? Qin Ruing really could not imagine it. She stared at the lover in front of her in a daze. Suddenly, she seemed to understand what Xianxia meant by eternal life. Xianxia looked at Qin Ruing. When he saw her dazed expression, he immediately regretted it. He really should not have told Yingying such an unbelievable thing. He should have optimized this story and told her in a way that Yingying could understand. Xianxia regretted it a little. However, the next moment, Qin Ruing suddenly threw herself into his arms. She looked up at her lover's face and suddenly burst into tears. I love you. If I have to put a time limit on this love, I hope it is. Chapter 120. Immortality. It was the ultimate dream of countless people, but it was obviously impossible to achieve. Although cultivators had a long lifespan compared to immortality, what was a few hundred years? Xianxia was in the deification stage, so his lifespan could reach at least 2,000 years. This also led to a problem in front of him. After all, Qin Ruing was just a mortal. Living over 100 years old was already a long life. Xianxia could live for 2,000 years, but Qin Ruing couldn't accompany him for 2,000 years. 5 years was enough for time to leave a trace of imperceptible traces on her face. Let alone 2,000 years. After going through so many hardships, he finally found his lover. Would he have to watch her wither in his arms after a few decades? Xianxia would never allow such a thing to happen. Absolutely not. He had no delusions about immortality. Because he knew that immortality was an unrealistic fantasy. No one could live forever, but if it was only a few decades, Xianxia felt that it was too little. So he wanted to help Yingying borrow another 500 years from the heavens. A cultivator in the gold core stage could have a lifespan of 500 years. Therefore, the moment this idea appeared in Xianxia's mind, it took root and sprouted almost immediately, growing into a towering tree. He must help Yingying reach the gold core stage. Although the spiritual aura of heaven and earth was thin, there were still hidden masters who were close to the gold core stage like great-granduncle. Without the inheritance of cultivators, great-granduncle could reach this step. What's more, he was holding Qin Ruing's hand and walking. She was just a gold core. Thinking of this, Xianxia immediately guided Qin Ruing to find the sense of qi. To become a cultivator, the first step was to find the sense of qi. Only after detecting the existence of the spiritual aura of heaven and earth could one use a secret method to refine the spiritual aura into one's own true essence and gather it in one's dantian. If one couldn't even detect the spiritual aura of heaven and earth, then what was the point of cultivating? The sense of qi was a mysterious feeling beyond the five senses. There were some talented individuals who didn't even need anyone to teach them. They could awaken their sense of qi when they were still in their infancy and instinctively refine the qi of heaven and earth. However, such geniuses were rarely seen. Therefore, if one really wanted to talk about it, humans, who were the wisest of all living things, were inferior to demons in this aspect. For example, Big Cat. It was originally a wild leopard that lived in the mountains. One day, when it suddenly awakened its sense of qi, it relied on its instincts and slowly stepped into the spirit-gathering stage. As more and more spirit qi accumulated, the big cat naturally reached the wisdom realm. Now that it had gained sentience, it could be considered to have truly stepped onto the path of cultivation. It was impossible for Xianxia to hide anything from Qin Ruing. Therefore he took out the best cultivation technique he had, the treasure of the Sky Yen Divine Sect, the Sky Yen Divine Canon. The cultivation method is the best, but Qin Ruing doesn't know what's wrong with her. She tosses and turns for a whole night but still can't find any qi. It was true that the spiritual energy on earth was sparse. However, the person sitting next to her is a spirit formation stage expert. Xianxia even used his own true essence to completely wrap her up. It wasn't an exaggeration to say that every breath she took was pure true essence that had been refined by Xianxia. It was even purer than the original heaven and earth spirit qi. However, even so, Qin Ruing still can't find any qi. To find the qi, a slower person would need a few hours, while a faster person would only need a few minutes. For example, Xianxia's method of using true essence to directly wrap her up is practically cheating. Unfortunately, she still can't feel it. There's no other way. Xianxia doesn't want to give her too much pressure, so he can only lie to her and say that everything is difficult at the beginning, and let her try again tomorrow morning. Qin Ruing can't even be considered as a martial artist. Her physical strength is already weak. After tossing and turning for an entire night, she is also tired, so she didn't suspect anything and fell asleep while hugging Xianxia. The next day, Qin Xueqing bought breakfast as usual. After breakfast, Xianxia took the little fellow to do morning exercises in the courtyard. Qin Ruing stayed in the house to continue to search for the qi. However, until lunchtime, Qin Ruing still can't find the qi. At this time, Xianxia can't help but feel anxious. Immortal cultivators are divided into realms, and every time a cultivator crosses a major realm, they will have an extraordinary transformation. However, the advancement of this realm is extremely difficult. Many people with mediocre aptitude may even be trapped in the qi refinement stage for their entire lives, and can't make any progress. He has been in the Tianyuan world for more than 500 years, and he has never heard of anyone who can't find the qi. If you can't find the qi and can't even enter the door, what kind of cultivator are you? Could it be? Is it because the cultivation methods of the Tianyuan world can't be used on Earth? Thinking of this, Xianxia immediately found Qin Xueqing, and then taught her a set of ordinary cultivation methods. Qin Xueqing thought that Xianxia taught her the cultivation method of the necromancer, so she immediately began to search for the qi according to what he said. However, Qin Xueqing and Qin Ruing are in the same situation. The two of them struggled until the afternoon, but still couldn't find the qi that Xianxia was talking about. If they can't find the qi, it means that they can't cultivate. The matter is a bit serious. Xianxia hesitated for a moment and then took the set of cultivation methods to Qin Yongyan, and prepared to let his father-in-law try it. Qin Yongyan is also a Dan stage grandmaster. After seeing how powerful Xianxia is, he has always been very interested in Xianxia's cultivation methods. So now that Xianxia came to him with the cultivation methods, Qin Yongyan immediately smiled and practiced according to what he said. The same treatment as Qin Xueqing. As soon as Qin Yongyan closed his eyes, Xianxia wrapped him with vital essence. However, after a few seconds, Qin Yongyan suddenly opened his eyes and chuckled. Is this the qi sense you were talking about? It's really a strange feeling. You feel it. Xianxia's expression changed abruptly. He immediately withdrew his vital essence and then asked nervously, then try again. See if you can absorb the surrounding spiritual qi into your body through the set of cultivation methods. Okay, I'll try. Qin Yongyan sat cross-legged on the ground with his hands on his knees, and then practiced according to the cultivation methods given by Xianxia. Xianxia looked at Qin Yongyan nervously. After about 10 minutes, Xianxia suddenly felt that the spiritual qi around Qin Yongyan began to flow slowly. Although it was extremely weak, It proved that there was nothing wrong with the cultivation methods. He could cultivate. Since there was no problem with the incantation, then what was the problem? With a stomach full of doubts, Xianxia quickly returned to the west wing. Qin Ruing was sitting on the bed trying hard to find the qi. After hearing Xianxia say that cultivation could prolong life, she was completely moved. After all, if possible, who wouldn't want to live a few more years? She worked very hard. Because she also wanted to be with Xianxia forever until the end of time. The little girl sat on the bed watching cartoons while curiously looking at Xianxia and Qin Ruing. Chapter 121. Since Qin Yongyan could cultivate it, it meant that there was nothing wrong with the cultivation technique itself. The Sky Yen God Sect's cultivation technique was based on righteousness and there were no shortcuts. However, it was a path that led straight to the Mahayana realm. Of the two cultivation techniques, one was the foundational cultivation technique for new disciples and the other was the Sky Yen God Sect's secret scripture. However, to cultivators in the Qi refinement stage, there was no difference between the two cultivation techniques. The great Tao flowed like mercury and every grain was round. It was impossible for the Sky Yen God Sect to keep their cultivation techniques to themselves. Allowing new disciples to cultivate incomplete foundational cultivation techniques was undoubtedly a foolish method of self-destruction. Qin Yongyan could cultivate it, but Qin Ruiying and Qin Xueqing could not sense qi. This made Xianxia very suspicious. If it was not a problem with the cultivation technique, could it be gender? However, that was obviously impossible. The Sky Yen God scripture did not have any requirements to be passed down to males and not females. As the sect master's daughter, Yu Zijin had cultivated the Sky Yen God scripture earlier than him. Before Xianxia left, Yu Zijin had already successfully stepped into the divine transformation stage and was given the title of Goddess Zijin. What exactly was the problem? Xianxia stood beside Qin Ruiying and looked at his lover's diligent appearance. The pressure in his heart increased. He could help her refine pills to forcefully raise her cultivation, but that would be meaningless. Was it really that difficult to sense qi? Xianxia was at a loss. At this moment, the little guy who was sitting on the bed was suddenly amused by the cartoon and laughed a series of loud laughter. Xianxia looked at the little fellow. After thinking for a while, he came to the little fellow's side and asked softly, "Nian Nian, can you help Daddy with something?" Hearing this, the little fellow immediately jumped into Xianxia's arms and laughed. "Okay. What can I help Daddy with?" "And sit properly first and then follow Daddy's instructions to sense." Under Xianxia's guidance, the little guy assumed a proper posture with his 5 hearts facing the sky. After that, Xianxia gently rapped her with his true yuan. "Nian Nian, use your heart to sense. Are there many things floating around you like dandelions?" The little fellow obediently closed her eyes and sensed for a while, but she did not feel anything. Thus she wrinkled her little nose and sniffed around like a cute puppy sniffing around. Xianxia looked at her appearance and knew that she was unable to calm her heart. Nian Nian was still too young and it seemed like she was unable to understand what he meant. Thinking of this, Xianxia couldn't help but sigh, ready to give up. He actually wanted to let a child to try. However, the little fellow's happy's true. "Daddy, I see a lot of the bubbles." She did not It was that she was with her eyes was with Lin. The little fellow happily stretched out her fingers and kept poking in the air. Seeing this, Xianxia was stunned. Nian Nian, this naughty little girl, could sense the qi? Because he was a little suspicious of the little fellow's feeling, Xianxia deliberately scattered his true yuan and guided her to find it. However, what Xianxia did not expect was that the little fellow could actually accurately point out the location of each ball of true yuan. "It's so fun. It's so fun." The little guy closed his eyes and started to shout happily. In the darkness, she felt that there were countless glowing bubbles around her, slowly flowing around her. Xianxia withdrew his true yuan. The spiritual qi of heaven and earth was too thin, so the moment he withdrew his true yuan, the little fellow immediately lost her sense of the spiritual qi of heaven and earth. "Daddy, it's gone. The bubbles are gone." The little fellow pouted and opened her eyes. Then she lay on the bed looking for the bubbles that came out of nowhere. Xianxia looked at the little fellow silently. He would not consider letting the little fellow start cultivating for the time being. After all, Nian Nian was only a 4-year-old child and this was not the Tianyuan world. In the future, Nian Nian would have to go to school. Xianxia did not want her to become an anomaly. An anomaly among children would be ostracized. After coaxing the little fellow to watch cartoons, Xianxia looked at Qin Ruiying. If even Nian Nian could cultivate, Then there was obviously something wrong with the two sisters. At this time, Qin Ruiying had already stopped cultivating. She heard the little fellow's movements. Seeing that her daughter could immediately find the feeling that she said, Qin Ruiying's face darkened. She said sadly, "Maybe I'm too stupid." Hearing this, she sat beside her, gently held her hand and comforted her. Everything is difficult at the beginning. Children are the spirits of heaven and earth and have not been affected by the turbid qi of the world, so it's easier for them to find that feeling than adults. In order to prevent her from doubting him, Shi even used his sister-in-law as an example to comfort her. "You're not stupid and neither is Hua Qing." Hua Qing reached the martial Dao master realm in her 20s. She's already a rare martial arts genius in this world. Even a genius like her can't find the qi, let alone you, an ordinary person who has never cultivated before. "Don't worry, don't pressure, let's take it slow." "Okay, then I'll try again." After hearing Shi's words, Qin Ruiying immediately relaxed a lot. Even Hua Qing could not learn it. It could be seen that what Shi taught them must be much more difficult than martial arts. Therefore it was normal for her not to be able to learn it in a short time. Thinking of this, Qin Ruiying immediately relaxed a lot. After smiling at Shi, she closed her eyes and began to cultivate again. However, she was no longer stressed, but the pressure in Shi's heart was increasing. After leaving a ball of vital essence to gently wrap her up, Shi quietly walked out of the west wing and then went to the main room to find Qin Yongyan. The Qin family's courtyard house was on the west coast of Shikahai. A little further down was the center of Huaxia's power, Songnanhai. Shi had been back on Earth for so long. Based on the places he had been to so far, Songnanhai's spirit energy was only second to Qinling. It was definitely an excellent place to cultivate in seclusion. Qin Yongyan had been sitting in the main room cultivating. After tossing and turning for the whole afternoon, when Shi once again walked into the main room, she could even see a trace of cloud rising around Qin Yongyan's body. This was the manifestation of the condensed spirit energy of heaven and earth. It also meant that Qin Yongyan had begun to try to refine the spirit energy of heaven and earth. Shi did not tell Qin Yongyan the truth. He simply described the problem that the sisters were facing now. Qin Yongyan was very smart. Therefore he immediately understood that Shi was hinting him not to mention cultivation in front of the sisters, so as not to bring unnecessary psychological pressure to them. Shi was in charge of dinner. After the meal was served, under Shi's constant urging, Qin Xueqing reluctantly walked out of the east wing. However, after she was at the table she just ate 2 mouthfuls and then said that she was full. After that she quickly returned to the east wing, closed the door and continued to cultivate. Her sister-in-law was obsessed with martial arts. Otherwise she could not have reached the Dan stage at this age. Shi showed her a new way, so now she was in high spirits. She must find the qi sense that Shi mentioned. Perhaps it was due to her sister's influence, but Qin Ruiying's mood gradually improved. Shi knew what she was thinking, so he patted his chest and said that in the future he would take care of the children and do the housework. She only needed to concentrate on cultivating. Hearing this, Qin Ruiying went back to her room and continued to cultivate. There were only 3 people left in the main hall. Shi and Qin Yongyan ate silently, while the little fellow took care of the big cat very generously. At this time, Qin Yongyan suddenly glanced at Shi without a trace. He faintly felt that. Chapter 122. The next morning, Qin Xueqing didn't buy breakfast today, so Shi went to the roadside stall and bought some. This time he didn't buy steamed buns but jianbing fruits for the little fellow. The little fellow had been eating Cantonese morning snacks for 2 days. Shi thought that her appetite would be very picky, so he bought jianbing fruits just to let her have a taste. If she really didn't like it he would have to cook it himself. However, what Shi didn't expect was that the little fellow was instantly interested in the jianbing fruits after getting them. She held the oiled paper bag, opened her mouth wide and took a big bite. Her little face was immediately covered with a lot of sauce. The little fellow frowned and chewed hard. After chewing for a while she suddenly handed the jianbing fruits to Shi and laughed. "Delicious. Papa, eat it." Because of the existence of the big cat, she had now developed a good habit of sharing with others all the time. Seeing this, Shi smiled and touched her head. He said softly, "Good girl, you are delicious. Don't get oil all over your body." Nodding, the little fellow took the jianbing fruits and fed them to the big cat. At this time, Shi turned to look at Qin Ruiying. Qin Ruing just ate a few mouthfuls casually. Now she was sitting on the bed and cultivating again. It was not right to say that she was cultivating because she hadn't even entered the door. Now she was still at the stage of looking for qi. This was actually a very boring thing, but in order to keep up with Qianxi's pace she had to work hard. Qianxi saw it all in her eyes. He was obviously very anxious in his heart, but he had to act as if nothing had happened, which really made him a little uncomfortable. Qianxi checked Qin Ruing's physical condition. She was very healthy and there was no problem. Except for the lack of qi, everything was perfect. If Qin Ruing couldn't find qi, it was normal. In that case, it was unreasonable that Qin Xueqing couldn't find the sense of qi. She was a clasping Dan master after all, and her 5 senses were much better than normal people. She could even perfectly control her own body, down to her skin and internal organs. But even so, Qin Xueqing still couldn't feel the spiritual qi of heaven and earth. A dignified martial Dao grandmaster was actually inferior to a 4-year-old child. The more he thought about it, the more ridiculous it seemed. Qianxi was afraid that the truth would shock them, so he could only emphasize to them how difficult it was to find qi. As for Qin Yongyan, he could clearly see that there was something wrong with the two of them, so he simply hid in his room all day and silently cultivated. The morning passed quickly. Qin Ruiying, Qin Xueqing and Qin Yongyan basically wouldn't show up except for meal times. The little girl was very sensible. After hearing that her mother was studying, she did not disturb her mother. After lunch, Qianxi thought about it for a while and went out with the little fellow. Their destination was the largest Chinese medicine wholesale market in Shangjing. He had bought so many herbs in Zhonghai before, and he didn't expect to have to buy them again so soon. For his wife and sister-in-law, Qianxi was now going all out. So when he took the little fellow to the Chinese medicine market, he wasted millions again. Spirit Gathering Pill. It was an entry-level pill that could allow qi refining stage cultivators to quickly accumulate qi. Because of the lack of a few core ingredients, the effect of the pill might be greatly reduced like the simplified version of the Spirit Gathering Pill. Qianxi really didn't have a solution for their current situation, so he could only put all his hopes on the pill. Maybe after they ate the Spirit Gathering Pill, they would be able to sense the spiritual qi of heaven and earth after having true qi in their bodies. The idea was not bad and it was worth a try. So Qianxi waited until midnight. After the truck brought the herbs he needed, he immediately began to make the Spirit Gathering Pill in the yard. In order to improve the effect of the pill, Qianxi even directly poured true qi into it. Although it wasn't much, it should be able to slightly increase the effect of the pill. Alchemy was a very time-consuming thing, so when he finally finished making the Spirit Gathering Pill, Qin Ruiying had already fallen into a deep sleep. Looking at his wife's diligent appearance for the past 2 days, Qianxi couldn't help but be angry and anxious. He was very irritated, so he simply went to the yard and started to set up a formation. With the Qin family's courtyard as the foundation, he gathered all the spiritual qi around Zhonghai. Spirit Gathering, Qi Concealing, Defense, 3 formations in one. It could be considered as opening up an excellent place for them to cultivate. Frost and Snow Night, Cold Wind Blew. Dongming Alley was peaceful and tranquil, a stark contrast to the noisy Hohai bar. Qianxi stood alone on the roof of the main hall, looking at the cold crescent moon. His heart was filled with endless anxiety. No matter what, he had to let Yingying step into the Aura's core stage. He stood there for an entire night. It wasn't until the sun rose from the east, and when a hazy glimmer appeared on the horizon, that Qianxi knocked on his sister-in-law's door. His sister-in-law was a master. She only needed to rest for 2 hours a day, so when Qianxi knocked on the door she had already started cultivating. Qianxi handed her a Spirit Gathering Pill. She didn't ask any questions, directly swallowed it, then returned to her room to continue cultivating. Qianxi, on the other hand, stood outside the door, silently sensing the movements in her room. There was still something wrong. Even though the Spirit Gathering Pill didn't have an immediate effect, but shouldn't there be some reaction? Why wasn't there any movement at all? Qianxi anxiously paced back and forth in the yard. After an unknown amount of time, the little fellow slowly woke up. Qianxi hurriedly ran to buy breakfast, then helped her get up and wash up. Qin Ruiying sat on the bed and looked at Qianxi, who had finished her work. Suddenly she sighed softly. After all, he was the one who slept beside her. So no matter how well Qianxi hid it, Qin Ruiying still keenly sensed that something was wrong with him. But she didn't say anything. After a simple breakfast, she silently sat on the bed and continued cultivating. Xianxia fed her the spirit-gathering pill, indicating that she should relax, then went to find Qin Yongyan again. At this time, Qin Yongyan had already successfully cultivated a trace of true essence. Even though it was very small, it represented that he had become a true cultivator. Xianxia hesitated for a moment, but still handed the spirit-gathering pill to him. Hearing Xianxia say that it was helpful for cultivation, Qin Yongyan immediately swallowed it. The spirit-gathering pill melted in his mouth. Qin Yongyan was stunned for a moment, then hurriedly sat cross-legged. Xianxia stood next to him, silently sensing the changes in the spirit qi around him. 10 minutes later, Xianxia came to the courtyard. He looked at the west wing, then looked at the east wing. Then he turned around and looked at the main hall. The door of the main hall was wide open. From his position he could just see the large red sandalwood table carved with dragons. On top of the table was Li Bai's, gazing at the Heavenly Gate mountain. The Heavenly Gate is broken and the Chu River is opened. The blue water flows east. Suddenly, a murderous aura suddenly exploded from his body. A formless energy quickly spread out with him as the center. It was as if a stone had suddenly been dropped into a calm water surface, causing ripples to appear one after another. Crack. In the small courtyard, the blue stone slabs shattered. Following that, the ground beneath his feet suddenly sank nearly a foot deep. Xianxia looked up at the sky with a gloomy face. He finally knew why. Qin Ruiying, Qin Xueqing. Chapter 123. Sai Courtyard. The blue stone floor in the inner courtyard was completely shattered, and the ground strangely sank nearly a foot deep. Because it was covered by snow when the ground broke, it did not raise too much smoke and dust. Xianxia stood in the middle of the courtyard silently. This movement also alarmed the others in the courtyard. The little fellow was the first to run out. When she came out of the door, she saw the movement made by Xianxia. Wow! The scene in front of her completely shocked the little fellow. She opened her small mouth and opened her eyes wide, looking around curiously. The courtyard seemed to have been hit by a meteor. The closer to the center of the courtyard, the deeper the ground collapsed. The originally flat blue stone floor had been completely destroyed, and the collapse of the ground also caused a lot of soil to be turned up. It looked like the scene of a forced demolition. The little fellow stepped forward and carefully walked down the steps. He was very smart. She knew that the blue stone floor could not be stepped on, so she carefully stepped on the mud, and then by holding her hands flat to maintain her balance, she moved closer to Xianxia step by step. Because it was winter, the soil was frozen very tightly, so it became very slippery. If she was not careful, she would slip. The more she moved forward, the more difficult it was to move forward. The little fellow took only 2 steps forward, and suddenly she staggered and almost slipped. She waved her little hands and tried to maintain her balance, but after standing firm, she did not dare to move forward. Therefore she had to stand there honestly, pouting and shouting timidly, "Papa?" Her voice was very small, but it suddenly pulled Xianxia's thoughts back. Xianxia hurriedly turned her head to look, just in time to see the little girl's pitiful appearance, so she quickly came to her side and directly carried her up. Xianxia carried her back to the steps of the west wing, and the little fellow lay on his body, constantly looking back at the scene in the center of the courtyard. With her current experience, she obviously could not understand what was going on, so she could only ask with some doubts, "Papa, what's going on?" "Well, it's nothing. It was a small earthquake just now." "What is an earthquake?" Xianxia choked on her question. After thinking about it, he held the little fellow and shook her up and down. Then he said with a smile, "This is an earthquake." Little rascal's head was shaking from his shaking, even more than when he was riding Big Cat. However, perhaps it was because of the experience of riding the Big Cat that the little guy did not seem to be afraid even under such violent shaking. Instead, he hugged Xianxia's head and shouted, "This is so fun." Hearing this, Xianxia hurriedly stopped what he was doing and then warned with a serious expression, "That's not right. Not fun at all. Earthquakes are very scary. When it happens, you have to hide in a safe place such as the kitchen, the corner of the bathroom, or under the table. Do you understand?" "Oh." Seeing the serious look on Xianxia's face, the little fellow immediately stopped laughing and nodded, pretending to be serious. After emphasizing the dangers of earthquakes to her, Xianxia put the little fellow down, and then told her that it was fine here and asked her to go play with the Big Cat. After all, the little girl was still young, so when she heard her father's words, she simply thought that it wasn't a big deal. Thus, she threw the scene in front of her to the back of her mind and ran back to the West Wing to continue watching cartoons. The three people of the Qin family had already heard the noise and came to the courtyard. After his daughter ran back to the house, Qin Ruiying walked to Xianxi's side, gently held his hand and asked worriedly, "What's wrong?" Xianxia did not speak but pulled her directly to the main hall. In the main hall, Qin Yongyan had been waiting for a long time. After Qin Xueqing also arrived, Xianxia looked at the Heavenly Gate mountain again, and then asked in a deep voice, "What is the Heavenly Gate?" Hearing this, Qin Yongyan's eyelids suddenly twitched and his expression became more serious. Qin Ruiying and Qin Xueqing looked at each other, and their faces were full of doubts. Heavenly Gate Xian knew Qin had never cared before. He returned from the Tianyuan world and returned to an environment with sparse spiritual energy like Earth. Even if all the masters in the world were gathered in front of him, a dignified soul formation cultivator, coming to such a degenerate planet, it would only be a matter of one move. It was like putting an MMA fighter in a nursing home or kindergarten. He could easily punch the Nanshan nursing home and kick the Beihai kindergarten. Therefore Xianxia had never cared about the inheritance on Earth. But now he found that he was wrong. He was ridiculously wrong. Qin Yongyan and Yanyan could cultivate. Qin Ruiying and Qin Xueqing couldn't cultivate. Qin Xueqing was even a martial Dao master of the same realm as Qin Yongyan. But why couldn't Qin Xueqing sense qi? Why? Xianxia didn't think in this direction before because he had lived for more than 500 years, and he had never heard of anyone who couldn't even sense qi. There were many cultivators who couldn't break through the qi refinement stage, and that was because their aptitude was too low. But if they couldn't even sense the spiritual energy of heaven and earth, wouldn't they be worse than those unintelligent wild beasts? This was obviously not a problem of aptitude. Qin Ruiying and Qin Xueqing were only cousins, not biological sisters. So there was only one thing left in common between them. And that was their identity as Xiannu. That mysterious heavenly gate could actually make people unable to sense the spiritual energy of heaven and earth. Xianxia felt a little scared when he thought about it. So the most important thing now was to figure out what the so-called heavenly gate was. After Xianxia asked this question, the main hall suddenly fell into silence. After a long time, Qin Yongyan looked at Xianxia and sighed. The heavenly gate is an ancient legend. According to records, it hasn't appeared for more than 100 years. It hasn't appeared for more than 100 years? Then what exactly is it? The old people in the village said that the heavenly gate is the southern heavenly gate of the heavenly court. When the heavenly gate is opened, mortals can ascend and become immortals. What a joke. Hearing this, Xianxia couldn't help but angrily scold. It's the 21st century and there are satellites everywhere in the sky. People in the United States have even climbed to the moon. Why is this lousy village still practicing feudal superstition? It wasn't that Xianxia looked down on Earth, but it was the truth. In terms of the cultivation environment on Earth, Grand Uncle's pseudo-core state was probably the peak of the world. He hadn't even completely condensed his gene Dan, let alone yuanying. How could he want to ascend and become an immortal? This might be the biggest joke Xianxia had heard in more than 500 years. However, after hearing Xianxia's scolding, Qin Yongyan shook his head disapprovingly, but he didn't immediately reply. Xianxia was stunned for a moment and immediately realized that he had lost his composure. He didn't know what had happened to him recently. His hostility was getting stronger and stronger, and he was becoming more and more irritable. If there was something that didn't go his way, he would lose his composure. This situation seemed to have started after he came to Shangjing. Thinking of this, Xianxia couldn't help but take a deep breath. After adjusting his emotions, he looked at Qin Yongyan again. After seeing that he had calmed down a lot, Qin Yongyan replied seriously, "That's not a joke. It's true." Xianxia was stunned. He was really confused. Could it be that the cultivators on Earth thought that a Jindan was an immortal emperor? Not to mention what kind of realm an immortal emperor was. In terms of lifespan, an immortal emperor was said to be immortal as long as heaven and earth. How many years did a Jindan cultivator have? A mere 500 years. In the eyes of cultivators, 500 years was just a blink of an eye. It was nothing at all. Forget it, there might be a cognitive gap between him and Qin Yongyan. Chapter 124. What's a Xiannu? Qin Xueqing couldn't help but roll her eyes when she heard this question. because she had already told Xianxia many times. Since her sister-in-law didn't want to answer, Qin Ruoying immediately explained, Xiannu is the witch who presides over the Elysium sacrificial ceremony. The sacrificial ceremony is held once a year, similar to the ancestral worship during the New Year. What are the conditions? What are the requirements to become a Xiannu? There are no special requirements. You have to be under the age of 10 and automatically step down when you reach the age of 30. No requirements. As long as you're of the right age? Xianxia pondered for a moment. Then, as if he had thought of something, he quickly asked, what happens after you're chosen? Do you have to go through any ceremony before you become a Xiannu? Ceremony. Qin Ruoying thought for a moment, then said with some uncertainty, I can't remember clearly. I remember that on the day we became Xiannu we entered the ancestral hall. After entering, the clan elder asked us to make a wish. He said that every Xiannu can make a wish. Yes. Qin Xueqing also seemed to have thought of something at this time and immediately echoed, I remember that my wish at that time was to become a martial Dao master. And then, Qin Xueqing was a little distressed. After thinking for a long time she muttered, and then I forgot. Hearing this, Xianxia couldn't help but become serious. There was a problem. When they became Xiannu, Qin Ruoying was 8 years old and Qin Xueqing was 6 years old. Children at this age should be able to clearly remember some of the more important things. How could she forget such a big thing as becoming the Empyrean maiden? Thinking of this, Xianxia couldn't help but turn his head to look at Qin Yongyan. Qin Yongyan seemed to know what he wanted to ask, so he directly answered, Xiannu make wishes in the ancestral hall. I can't go in, so I don't know what ceremony to hold before becoming a Xiannu. Xianxia frowned slightly. After hesitating for a moment, he then turned his head to Qin Ruoying and said very seriously, Ying, look at me and then do as I say. Okay. Qin Ruoying was a little confused, but out of her trust in Xianxia, she immediately nodded. Then at Xianxia's request she turned around and looked straight into Xianxia's eyes. Relax, take a deep breath, spit it out. Very good, Ying, look into my eyes. The soul-searching technique has certain side effects. Even if it is minimal, Xianxia can't use it on Qin Ruoying. Although he can't search her soul, he can try to hypnotize Qin Ruoying, and then use hypnosis to dig out the memories buried in her subconscious. Xianxia has never learned hypnosis, but he has seen the illusion of the Tianxian world, which is more advanced than hypnosis. Qin Ruoying is the person in the world who trusts him the most besides Nian Nian, so in less than 2 minutes, Xianxia has successfully hypnotized her. Ying, think about it. When you were 8 years old you became a Xiannu, walked into the ancestral hall, made a wish, and then, what else did you do? The human consciousness has 2 basic functions, executive and supervisory. The executive function allows us to control and regulate our own behavior, and the supervisory function allows us to observe our own behavior. Under normal circumstances, these 2 functions of the consciousness are connected, but hypnosis can sever the connection between the 2 functions. Under hypnosis, the hypnotized person will enter a special state of consciousness. Their executive function will be normal, and they will be able to accept the hypnotist's orders, but the supervisory function will be lost. When the supervisory function is lost, the brain will enter a subconscious state and from there dig out some forgotten things. Qin Ruoying looked at Xianxia with empty eyes. After hearing Xianxia's question, the expression on her face immediately showed some pain. After thinking for a long time, Qin Ruoying murmured, after making the wish, I saw a door. The door was talking to me. It called me over. Qin Ruoying's words were too vague and Xianxia didn't understand. But his intuition told him that this is a very important part. The light disappeared, drank the soul-restoring soup, became a Xiannu. Soul-restoring soup? Soul. Xianxia was shocked and then he stood up from the chair with an ashen face. He quickly formed a hand seal and then gently pressed his right hand on Qin Ruoying's head. Humans have 3 spiritual souls and 7 physical souls. After a person dies, the 7 physical souls will disperse, and then the heaven soul will ascend to heaven, the earth soul will enter the earth, and the life soul will enter the cycle of reincarnation. The heaven soul is yang, the earth soul is yin, and the life soul is yang. Therefore the earth soul is also called the yin soul. Xianxia's soul was damaged, so even though he was with Qin Ruoying every day he didn't realize it. Qin Ruoying's soul was damaged. The 7 physical souls are all there, but one of the 3 spiritual souls is missing. She lost her earth soul, so no wonder she couldn't find Qi. One of the 3 spiritual souls is missing, so she can't be considered a complete person. How can she embark on the orthodox path of immortality? At this thought, Xianxia immediately went to Qin Xueqing's side. He didn't say anything and directly placed his hand on Qin Xueqing's head. Qin Xueqing was stunned. Before she could react, Xianxia had already retracted his hand and stood beside Qin Ruiying. He lightly brushed his hand across Qin Ruiying's face and then couldn't help but murmur, "No wonder you guys can't find Qi no matter what. So the price to become Xian Nu is to give up the earth soul." To mortals, missing one of the 3 spiritual souls was not a fatal problem. Missing 1 spiritual soul meant that the body was weak and sickly. Missing 2 spiritual souls meant that the body was in a coma. Missing 3 spiritual souls meant that the 7 physical souls would disperse and the person would die. The so-called soul recovery soup was probably a prescription to allow Xian Nu to live like a normal person. Without the earth soul, Xian Nu would never be able to become a necromancer. Even if she practiced martial arts, she would never be able to break through to the controlled Dan realm. As for cultivating, it was even more impossible. Xianxia woke Qin Ruiying up. When she woke up, she immediately held her head as if she had a headache. Seeing this, Xianxia gently rubbed her acupoints. When she finally felt better, Xianxia said softly, "Ying, I have to go to the village again." Qin Ruiying was a little confused and didn't know what had happened. When she heard that Xianxia was going to the village, she immediately asked nervously, "Go to the village? Why?" "It's nothing. Just rest well. Take good care of Nian. Don't let her know that I'm gone. Don't worry, I'll definitely be back before the afternoon." Seeing Xianxia's serious expression, Qin Ruiying could only nod and agree. She opened her mouth, wanting to say something. But at this time, Xianxia had already turned and walked out of the main hall. Qin Ruiying hurriedly got up and chased after him. But when she walked out of the main hall, Xianxia had already soared into the sky, disappearing from her sight in the blink of an eye. Qin Ruiying stood outside the main hall, looking at the slightly gloomy sky. After a long time, she lowered her head and looked at the limestone fragments in the courtyard. A trace of worry flashed across her face. Why did he go? Chapter 125. Winter in the Qinling Mountains was very dark. It was clearly noon, but the visibility in the mountains was never more than 200 or 300 meters. The fog was thick and the snow was white. This small village hidden in the valley was as quiet and peaceful as ever. Outside the solemn ancestral hall, the huge bronze cauldron had been carefully cleaned. The accumulated snow on top of the cauldron had also been cleared away, revealing the thick and dignified aura of a bronze artifact that had been buried in snow for a long time. The originally empty square was now filled with countless ritual tools and props. Great-granduncle's body was nowhere to be found. According to the tradition of the village, after setting up a cenotaph for him, he still needed to be held in the square outside the ancestral hall for 7 days and 7 days before the burial ceremony could be held. The main character of this funeral was only great-granduncle. Third uncle was on the verge of death, but he was lucky enough to survive. Third uncle would probably secretly rejoice when he woke up. Zhou Xian and Li Hoan hid in the house and drank to drown their sorrows. The sweet and bitter taste entered their throats, but the 2 of them wanted to get drunk. However, their cultivation was so high that even getting drunk had become an extravagant hope. Although several days had passed, the appearance of that young man seemed to be becoming clearer in their minds. Zhou Xian and Li Hoan were the same age and 2 years older than Qin Yongyan. The village was not a sect, nor was it a family clan. This was an ordinary village with a few hundred families living in it. Of course, this village had its own special characteristics. The 100 schools of Qi Men and the 6 paths of miscellaneous studies. Each family might have a different inheritance. Zhao Xinhuai, Li Hoan, and Qin Yongyan all learned martial arts, so they had been very playful since they were young. As the backbone of the village, Zhao Xinhuai and Li Hoan had always had their own pride. Third uncle was their role model. Great-granduncle was their dream. But now everything had been shattered. Until that day they finally understood what was power. That was absolute power, and also a power that made people despair. Everyone was frightened. Even though the great-granduncle, who was the most senior, the strongest, and the most respected person in the village, died on the spot, no one dared to stand out and say that they would avenge him. The elders were silent. After great-granduncle died, The 7 elders didn't even dare to show their faces. They just let that man swagger away. Old Qin was incredible. She gave birth to a good daughter, and her daughter found a good son-in-law. Who would have thought that after competing with Qin Yongyan for most of their lives, they would lose in this aspect? The more Zhao Xinghai thought about it, the more frustrated he felt. He picked up the earthen jug and drank from it. Li Hoan was stunned for a moment, then he raised the earthen jar and clinked it with him. It was still snowing outside. After drinking this jar of wine, they had to go out and clear the snow to prevent the bronze cauldrons and magic tools in the square from being buried by the snow. After all, it was the great-granduncle's sacrificial offering. They couldn't be too shabby. Both of them were grandmasters of the dance stage, so after drinking, they casually put on a thin layer of clothing and walked out of the door. Then they took a broom and swept the snow on the ground. It was obviously noon, but because the fog blocked the sun, the whole sky looked very gloomy, as dreary as before a rainstorm. The gloomy weather made people feel even more gloomy. Bah, this damn weather. Zhao Xinghai cursed bitterly as he swept the snow with a broom. Suddenly, he seemed to feel something, so he quickly looked up at the sky. He saw that in the foggy sky, there suddenly appeared a faintly discernible black spot. The black spot was getting bigger and bigger. Zhao Xinghai couldn't help but straighten his body, looking up to see it more clearly. Old Li, look. Their eyesight was far better than ordinary people, so Li Hoan immediately found that very small black spot. It seemed to be a person. In just a breath's time, that black shadow had already flown directly above their heads. At this time the two finally saw the figure clearly. It was him. Even if this young man turned into ashes, he would be able to recognize him at a glance. Zhao Xinghai was shocked. Almost without thinking, he raised the broom and put on a defensive posture. However, the young man flying in the sky didn't seem to see them at all. They didn't see him do anything, but a long sword suddenly appeared in his hand. Oh no! As soon as he saw the sword, Zhao Xinghai panicked. But before he shouted, he saw the young man gently slashing the sword at the ancestral hall below. A sword gleam with golden light shot out. As the sword gleam flew toward the ancestral hall, it slowly became bigger. At first it looked like an ordinary long sword. In the blink of an eye, it had become dozens of times bigger. When it was about to reach the ancestral hall, the sword gleam seemed to have become a high-speed train, directly hitting the middle of the ancestral hall's door. Boom! The ancestral hall's door exploded with a loud bang, immediately setting off thousands of violent turbulence. The wooden door was swept by the violent turbulence, instantly smashed into countless pieces. However, it wasn't over yet. After hitting the ancestral hall's door, the sword gleam didn't stop. Like a train that didn't stop, the sword gleam passed through the front yard, crushed the main hall, and only stopped when it hit the hillside behind the ancestral hall. This young man's casual swing of the sword actually cut the ancestral hall in half. The sword gleam disappeared. The violent turbulence that it set off became even more violent. Zhao Xinghai stood in the square, holding his dantian and crossing his arms in front of him. The violent flying sand and gravel kept hitting his body, causing his skin and flesh to hurt. If he continued to resist like this, he might suffer unnecessary injuries. So Zhao Xinghai thought for a while and had no choice but to put down his pride as a grandmaster. He suddenly lay on the ground, then covered his head with both hands, and prayed that the storm would soon subside. After a long time, the turbulence finally calmed down and the smoke and dust dissipated. The solemn ancestral hall had been split into two, as if the middle part had been forcefully removed. It was a scene of broken walls and ruins. Zhao Xinghai lay on the ground. After feeling that the storm had subsided, he secretly raised his head to look at the situation. Li Hoan lay not far away from him. The open space around the square was full of broken wood and gravel, and the ancestral hall was also split in half. He hesitated for a moment, then raised his head to look at the sky. That young man, holding a long sword, he looked like a god descending from the heavens, looking down on all living beings with an expressionless face. He gently landed not far in front of Zhao Xinghai. Then his voice slowly reached Zhao Xinghai's ears. I don't want to kill for no reason, so I want to ask you to tell me, Xian Yu's ghost, where is it? These words were not directed at Zhao Xinghai alone. His voice was very soft, but it rang in every corner of the village at the same time. The tranquility of the village was broken. Countless people came out of their rooms and rushed toward the square. Looking from the sky, it was like a piece of white paper suddenly appeared with many ants. The crowd was crowded but no one dared to approach the square. Xianxia held a long sword, silently looking at the ancestral hall in front of him. Suddenly, a group of old men came out from the ruins of the ancestral hall. There were a total of 7 of them, all wearing white training clothes, and they were of different sizes. The leader was holding the dragon-headed walking stick of great-granduncle that day. He probably took over great-granduncle's position after his death. The 7 old men stood on the steps looking at Xianxia from afar. After hesitating for a moment, the leader of the old men sighed softly. "You are already a heavenly being at such a young age. Why do you have to force us old bones?" Hearing this, Xianxia could not help but sneer. "Hand over the Xianyin soul and I promise not to hurt anyone." As his voice fell, the leader of the old men fell silent. The few old men beside him could not help but have a slight change in expression. Immediately after, they silently communicated with their eyes. This ancient village hid many secrets. For example, Xianxu's ghost was actually the key to opening the Divine Gate. The Divine Gate had not appeared for more than 100 years, and Xianxu had been replaced by batches. It was not until this batch that they finally received a heavenly warning, confirming that the Divine Gate was about to open. This was also their last chance. Several old men looked at Xianxia at the bottom of the steps, silently communicating. Chapter 126. The wind and snow continued. The elders did not speak. They were communicating with their eyes. Perhaps it was their unique tacit understanding. Xianxia did not understand, nor did he bother to guess. He stood in the square with his sword in hand, quietly waiting for their reply. More and more people gathered around, but no one dared to approach the square. Zhou Xian and Li Hoan had already retreated to the small house where they were drinking. The cold wind whistled past and the square was a scene of desolation. After about 2 minutes, the elder with the dragon-headed cane finally turned his head and glanced at Xianxia. But then he shifted his gaze away. The expression on his face was very complicated, as if he was still struggling with something. In fact, on the day when Xianxia took away Qin Ruiying, they had already discussed it. At that time they chose to compromise. But what they did not expect was that Xianxia would actually come back and want to take back Xianxu's ghost. Everyone handed the right to make the decision to him, which put a lot of pressure on him. After looking at the elders again, seeing that they all nodded at him, the elder frowned and finally made the final decision. "We agree to your request." Hearing this, Xianxia could not help but nod, very satisfied with his answer. The elder slowly walked down the stairs with the dragon-headed cane, then went straight to the giant bronze cauldron. "The ghosts of Xianxu have been sealed in this giant cauldron for generations. I will now release them." After explaining to Xianxia, the elder suddenly jumped up and inserted the dragon-headed cane in his hand into the giant bronze cauldron. The sound of metal colliding was suddenly heard. Immediately after, a golden light suddenly emerged from the giant bronze cauldron. The golden light was as small as the light from a laser pointer at first. But in the blink of an eye, the light had become as thick as a bucket. The golden light burst into the sky. A crack was instantly torn in the gloomy sky. The clouds in the sky churned. As if affected by something, with the golden light as the center, a huge cloud vortex gradually condensed in the clouds. What was even stranger was that the cloud vortex was rotating at a speed visible to the naked eye. The old man standing beside the giant cauldron became excited when he saw the scene in front of him. Suddenly, a faint fluorescent golden barrier appeared above the village, instantly enveloping the entire valley. Then a strong vibration came from the ground as if there was an earthquake. Immediately afterward, a golden light pillar as thick as a bucket rose from the 4 corners of the valley. These 5 pillars of light seemed to be the pillars of the barrier. When the light pillars rose from the 4 corners, the barrier in the sky became even more dazzling. The barrier was like a golden tortoise shell, encircling the valley where the village was located. The wind and snow that filled the sky suddenly stopped. The sun broke through the clouds. Almost instantly, everyone felt their eyes light up and their vision widened a lot. Formation array? Seeing this, Xianxia couldn't help but frown. He still remembered that there was a stone tablet at the entrance of the village, with the word Fangxin written on it. So he turned his head to look at the entrance of the village, only to find that the stone tablet was located at the place where the light pillar rose. He originally thought that this village only had a simple concealment formation, but after it was activated, Xianxia found that this formation array was no small matter. There were only a few functions of the formation array: trapping, killing, illusory, and some non-offensive auxiliary formations, such as breath concealment and spirit gathering. This formation array was arranged according to the terrain of the dragon vein, and could be said to be very expensive. After the 5 light pillars rose, the spiritual energy of heaven and earth in the entire formation suddenly swept over like a tide, wave after wave. Xianxia hadn't felt this surging spiritual energy of heaven and earth for a long time. But it was a little strange. With the conditions of the earth, even if it was a spirit-seizing formation set up by a Daoist stage cultivator, it was impossible to set off such a strong spiritual energy tide in such a short time. Xianxia thought for a while. Then he suddenly understood. The formation in front of him was not a spirit-seizing formation, but a composite formation with both spirit-gathering and spirit-binding functions at the same time. The formation used the valley as the base, the 4 stone tablets in the 4 directions as the formation door, the giant bronze cauldron in the center of the square as the formation eye, and the valley terrain as the formation pattern. After the formation was set up, it would continuously seize the spiritual energy of heaven and earth from the Qinling Mountains, and then bind the spiritual energy within the formation. To seize such a large amount of spiritual energy of heaven and earth from the earth, this formation array was set up at least 500 years ago. The spirit-binding formation was a one-time use formation. After it was activated, the spiritual energy of heaven and earth accumulated over the years would burst out at once. In the heavenly jade world, cultivators above the golden core stage would usually set up a spirit-binding formation in their cave abodes, in case of emergency. This was like rain from the sky. So Xianxia hurriedly sat cross-legged on the ground, taking advantage of the surging spiritual energy tide, and began to cultivate crazily. The opportunity couldn't be missed, so Xianxia didn't want to investigate why the old man suddenly activated this one-time auxiliary formation array. However, not long after he sat down cross-legged, the 4 light pillars in the north, south, east, and west suddenly turned into rainbows like a rainbow bridge, and suddenly connected with the main light pillar above the giant bronze cauldron. The 5 light pillars suddenly gathered together, and the main light pillar immediately became very thick. Just by looking at its diameter, it was almost the same as the giant bronze cauldron. At this moment, the old man standing below the giant cauldron's face suddenly changed, and a burst of ecstasy appeared on his face. Then he suddenly knelt on the ground and shouted respectfully, "Welcome, Divine General." Before he finished speaking, a figure walked out of the light pillar. It was a burly man who was almost 2 meters tall. His upper body was bare, revealing his strong muscles. The man called Divine General was floating in mid-air. After slowly scanning the surroundings, he slowly opened his mouth and said, "Heaven's opening line, you only have the time of an incense stick. Speak." The old man knelt on the ground and looked up at the Divine General in the sky very sincerely. It seemed that he was so excited that his lips moved for a long time, but he didn't say a word. The elder ancestor's words were true. At this moment, Xianxia suddenly opened his eyes. He looked at the man flying in the sky, then looked at the old man kneeling on the ground. Then Xianxia's lips suddenly curled into a faint sneer. "I thought you were really going to return Xian Yu's spirit to me. I didn't expect that you just wanted to ask for help. Forget it, since you don't want to give it to me, I'll find it myself." As he said that, he slowly stood up from the ground. After hearing Xianxia's words, the Divine General lowered his head and noticed him. One was in the sky. One was on the ground. Chapter 127. The spirit-binding array that had existed for hundreds of years was suddenly activated. Wave after wave of heaven and earth spirit chi surged, giving Xianxia an illusion. It was as if he had returned to the Tianxian domain. The surging heaven and earth spirit chi created an extremely comfortable environment for him, so comfortable that all the pores on his body could not help but open up naturally. He really needed the nourishment of heaven and earth spirit chi. Now every breath he took was a great pleasure for Xianxia. The spirit chi surged and the golden light soared into the sky. When the so-called Divine General walked out of the pillar of light, Xianxia finally understood the meaning of the existence of this array. This spirit-binding array was actually the last trump card of the village. The Divine General of the Elysium. The accumulation of hundreds of years of the array was only in exchange for the time it took for the Divine General to appear. When Xianxia killed great-granduncle and took Qin Ruoying away, they did not activate the array. Now that he came back to ask for the ghost, these old guys finally chose to activate the array and tried to fight to the death with Xianxia. It could be seen that Xian Nu's ghost was more important to them than their own lives. Xianxia looked up at the burly man flying in the sky. A long sword of frost suddenly appeared in his hand. The old guys at least had the chance to struggle and hesitate, but he did not. Because he was faced with only one choice. Take back Yingying's ghost. Otherwise, when Qin Ruoying gradually grew old in his arms, Xianxia would also fall into endless pain and regret. He could not accept the arrival of that day. Therefore, then let's fight. If they were not willing to give, then let's fight. Xianxia was determined to kill, and the long sword of frost immediately glowed faintly. Then, under the slightly surprised gaze of the divine general, he suddenly waved the long sword in his hand. The tip of the sword went from bottom to top, drawing an arc in the air. A sword radiance suddenly flew out. Seeing that Xianxia dared to suddenly attack him, the divine general's eyes flashed with surprise. The sword radiance came menacingly, and in an instant, it was in front of him. He did not seem to move, but a ball of blazing flames suddenly sprang up around the divine general. A barrier of stellar energy that seemed to be made of flames instantly formed. Bang! The sword radiance slammed into the flame barrier, like a typhoon erupting, and a storm of chi soared into the sky. But right after that, the flame barrier suddenly expanded. Then a huge fireball with a diameter of more than 10 meters appeared in the air. Interesting. Accompanied by a burst of laughter, the divine general's figure suddenly flew out of the fireball. He suddenly stretched out his right hand and formed a claw with his 5 fingers. He clawed at the air and a golden fireball appeared in his palm. After the golden fireball appeared, the divine general's body seemed to be on fire. Golden flames kept jumping around him. Like the sun rising from the east, the golden fireball instantly ignited all the air within a radius of dozens of meters. The sun hung in the sky, the fire burning the sky. Xianxia stared intently at the tall and sturdy man in the sky, a trace of excitement rising in her heart. This move made him feel a hint of danger. The divine general seemed to be holding the sun in his hand, his body burning with raging flames. Like a meteor falling from the sky, he cut across the sky and smashed viciously toward Xianxia, who was standing on the ground. At this critical moment, Xianxia swung the sword in his hand, and in an instant, tens of thousands of sword radiances appeared. Countless long swords made of frost and snow appeared around him. They floated in the air, quietly waiting for orders. Xianxia pointed his sword to the sky, and the floating swords immediately turned their tips and aimed at the fireball in the sky. The third move of the moonlight sword technique. 10,000 swords returned to the sect. The densely packed long swords of frost and snow instantly converged into a long river of sword radiances, like the Milky Way flowing in reverse, and collided with the fireball in midair. The entire sky was instantly divided into 2 worlds. On one side of the divine general of the stellar of time, flames and snakes of fire danced in the sky. It was as if one was above the sun, the crown flow feathers shining brightly. On the other side of Xianxia, wind and clouds surged, snow and ice splattered everywhere, as if one was caught in the most violent snowstorm of the North Pole. The 2 of them seemed to be separated by an invisible and boundless glass wall. In one world there were 2 kinds of wonders. It was truly amazing. Boom. The moment the sword radiances met the fireball, it was as if a nuclear bomb had exploded. A strong shockwave suddenly erupted, and the old man closest to them was immediately sent flying by the violent strength chi. Such a violent shockwave instantly turned all the houses around the square into ruins. Fortunately, most of the people in the village were not ordinary people, and those who dared to come close to watch the battle were experts of a certain level of strength. But even so, the aftermath of the battle still caused them serious internal injuries. It was too terrifying. Just the aftermath of the battle between the 2 of them could cause such a huge amount of damage. Was he still human? Zhao Xinghuai lay on the ground, trembling. Suddenly he came to his senses and quickly stood up, clutching his chest in pain. Then he pulled Li Hoan up, turned around and shouted to the crowd behind him, "Everyone run! Leave the village. The farther the better." The crowd of onlookers fled in all directions. A battle of this level was no longer something they could watch. On the square, The shock wave caused by the battle between the two of them finally subsided. The square, which was originally the size of 2 basketball courts, seemed to have been hit by a huge invisible iron ball. With Xianxia as the center, a huge circular crater appeared on the ground of the square. The deepest part of the crater was at least 5 meters deep. Xianxia floated in the middle of the crater, facing the divine general of the stellar of time in the sky. After this collision, they had more or less figured out each other's strength, so they did not intend to attack immediately. The divine general looked at Xianxia thoughtfully, then suddenly laughed. Your cultivation is not very high, but the move you used just now was really powerful. From the looks of it, he seemed to be very interested in the sword art that Xianxia had just used. Is that so? Xianxia raised her eyelids and looked at the tall and sturdy man. She couldn't help but sneer. The divine general in front of him was not an immortal cultivator, but after exchanging blows with him, Xianxia could roughly estimate his strength. Above Yuanying and below soul formation. What about himself? In fact, he was now like a sorcerer without mana. He still had his realm, but his accumulation of vital energy was far from enough. When the array was activated just now, Xianxia took the opportunity to absorb a wave of spiritual energy from heaven and earth, which allowed him to successfully use the third move of the Moonlight Sword technique. 10,000 swords returned to origin. Xianxia floated above the crater, holding the long sword silently as if he was thinking about something. The divine general did not seem to be in a hurry, because the person in front of him had indeed piqued his interest. After a while. Chapter 128. Wasting time? He was probably stalling for time. After hearing the elder's words, the immortal general lowered his head and looked at Xianxia with a faint smile. He thought for a moment and suddenly spread his hands. Following that, 2 golden fireballs leaped up from his palms. I'm very interested in the sword technique you used just now. If you give it to me, I promise I won't attack again. He was very interested in Xianxia's sword technique. The expressions of the few old men who were hiding nearby changed drastically when they heard his words. If the immortal general didn't attack, then after he left, that young man would probably massacre the entire village. If they had known this would happen, they would have just returned the Yin soul to him. Xianxia held his sword and floated above the giant pit. He lowered his head and didn't say a word. No one knew what he was thinking. After hearing the immortal general's words, Xianxia looked up at him. It seemed that he didn't like the feeling of looking up at others. So Xianxia flew up until he reached the same height as the immortal general. Then he said calmly, "You want my sword technique? You have good taste." The Moonlight Sword technique was comparable to the 49 forms of heaven's divination. There were only 3 forms, but the power of these 3 forms would increase as the user's realm increased. Gold will always shine. Your cultivation isn't high enough, so you won't be able to use the true power of this sword technique. Why don't you give it to me? What do you think? The immortal general smiled. As he spoke, he looked at the 2 golden fireballs in his palms. The golden fireballs kept jumping as if they were silently threatening him. I might not be able to kill you in 30 minutes. But I don't think it'll be a big problem if I want to seriously injure you. The immortal general was very confident, as if he had Xianxia under control. Hearing this, Xianxia couldn't help but laugh. This sword technique is called the Moonlight Sword technique. It's of the Yin attribute. It might conflict with your fire attribute technique. That's not important. No one will complain about having too many techniques. The immortal general said indifferently. However, Xianxia's next words stunned him. I have a set of saber techniques that are comparable to a sword technique. It's of the Yang attribute. I think it'll be compatible with your technique. As soon as he finished speaking, Xianxia gently raised his left hand. Then a gust of wind suddenly blew in the deep pit below him. A small tornado suddenly rose from the bottom of the pit. Then it wrapped the dust and gravel on the ground and flew directly toward Xianxia's left hand. In the blink of an eye, a long saber made of dust suddenly appeared in his hand. After the dust blade was formed, it immediately formed a sharp contrast with the frost sword in his right hand. The saber was yellow, but the sword was clear and bright. Dust was the knife, frost and snow were the sword. He wanted to kill everyone in the world. The immortal general was stunned for a moment. Then he suddenly laughed wildly. Saber and sword mastery? Interesting. Then let me see if your saber is worthy of your sword. With that, the divine general clasped his hands together. The 2 sun-like blazing fireballs immediately merged into one, erupting with a powerful shockwave. An incomparably dazzling golden light suddenly exploded from his palm, illuminating the entire sky in a deathly white. The extreme of yang fire burning the sky and boiling the sea. While the immortal general was practicing, Xianxia was not idle. The frost sword in his right hand suddenly glowed with a faint cold light, and the dust blade in his left hand shone with a little yellow light. Moonlight sword technique, red sun saber technique. The saber and the sword merged. The saber cut the wind, the sword cut the clouds, and the wind and clouds were disturbed. As soon as this move was made, the world suddenly changed color. There seemed to be a wave of saber and sword behind Xianxia. The invisible wind and visible clouds in the sky strangely disappeared at the moment when the saber and sword came out together. The saber and sword were annihilated and the wind and clouds changed color. With Xianxia as the center, there seemed to be a vacuum zone within 100 feet. All the wind, clouds, dust, and even the spiritual chi of heaven and earth were expelled from the battlefield by him. Then he slashed the saber and sword in his hand toward the immortal general. In the courtyard. After watching an episode of cartoons, the little fellow sat on the bed and shouted, "Papa? Papa, I want to pee." She was very clingy. She knew how to go to the bathroom by herself, but she just didn't want to go alone. The little fellow shouted for a while. Her father, who used to respond to her calls, didn't come today. She pouted and was obviously a little unhappy, so she immediately lay on the bed and rolled. "Papa, Papa, Papa, where did you go?" After all, Qin Ruiying was just a mortal, so she didn't have the 5 senses as sharp as Qianxi's. She was still standing in the yard in a daze. Although Qianxia could even kill great-granduncle with one sword, Qin Ruiying had a faint unjustified worry after he left this time. She hadn't seen Qianxia for 5 years and she was really afraid to be separated from him again. Papa was not here and Mama didn't hear it. When the big cat saw that the little one was making a scene, it immediately jumped out of the bed and ran to Qin Ruiying's side. Then it rubbed its body against her feet. Meow. The big cat called Qin Ruiying back from her chaotic thoughts. As soon as she saw the big cat, she knew that something must have happened to Yan, so she ran to the west wing. Sure enough, before she stepped into the room, she had already heard the little fellow shouting for Papa. Children were always clingy, so sometimes when their mother was not around, they would start to look for their mother inexplicably when they went to the bathroom or went out to throw away the garbage. Once their mother didn't appear in time, then sorry. If it was light, they would be easily angry, and if it was heavy, they would cry, and it was very difficult to coax them. Qin Ruiying still spent too little time with the little fellow, so once the little fellow had anything, the first reaction was to look for her father, not her mother. She quickly sat beside the little fellow, gently helped her up, and then asked worriedly, "Yan, what's wrong?" "I want to pee." The little fellow pouted and said very discontentedly, "Then Mama will take you, okay?" As she said, Qin Ruiying reached out to pick up the little fellow. However, the little fellow pushed her away. "No, I want Papa. I want Papa." As she said, the little fellow suddenly pouted and cried. "I want Papa." The more she said, the more upset she became, and bean-sized tears suddenly fell from the corners of her eyes. Qin Ruiying was a little at a loss and could only softly comfort her. "Papa went out to buy something and will be back soon. If you want to pee, Mama will go with you, okay?" "No, I want Papa." The little fellow sat on the bed, her little hands kept patting the bed and her 2 legs kicked the bed at random. Looking at her like this, she was on the verge of exploding. Seeing her like this, Qin Ruiying suddenly looked a little embarrassed. After hesitating for a moment, she tentatively reached out her hand again. The little fellow did not refuse, and Qin Ruiying finally took her in her arms. Yan, Papa went out to buy something and he will be back soon. Yan, don't cry. Mama will be with you, okay?" "No. Papa said that he will never leave me. I want Papa. I want Papa." Hearing this, Qin Ruiying trembled all over and could not help but cry. At this moment she suddenly remembered the time when Yan was just born. At that time the little fellow was still a cute baby. As long as she was not held for a while, she would cry loudly. Whenever little Yan cried, Qin Ruiying would hold her in her arms in a panic. Shaking and shaking, it would take a long time for little Yan to stop crying and giggle. So what she was most afraid of at that time was that the little fellow would cry. Time flew and the child had grown so big. Chapter 129. Qin Ruiying held the little girl in her arms. All of a sudden she seemed to realize something. When she left Yan was still young, so she had no impression of her. Although Xianxia came back later, he had been with the little girl since he came back. With his meticulous care and love, Xianxia succeeded in occupying more and more weight in the little girl's heart. He had surpassed her mother and Aunt Zhang. Therefore the little girl only needed her father now. Her father was her whole world. The intimacy between the father and daughter at any time made Qin Ruiying feel very lost. Father, mother, child. They were supposed to be a close family of three. But because of the short separation before, there was a faint sense of alienation between them. The reason why Qin Ruiying felt alienated from Nian Yan was that she hadn't realized how she should integrate into the family. Because of Nian Yan's birth, the simple two-person world between her and Xianxia had completely turned into a brand new three-person world. As the father and mother, they had never appeared by the little girl's side at the same time. With the reunion of the family, when Xianxia showed great strength and confidence, Qin Ruiying was lost. It was a feeling that could make any woman lose herself. At the same time, it was also called a sense of security. Therefore she felt extremely worried when Xianxia just left for a while. Just like Nian Yan, she had to look for her father when she went to the toilet. Compared to her daughter, how much better was she? The mother and daughter were too dependent on Xianxia. He was the perfect husband and the perfect father. She, on the other hand, was just an unqualified mother. Thinking of this, Qin Ruiying suddenly stopped crying. After wiping her eyes without leaving a trace, she let go of the little girl and carefully wiped her tears. Nian Yan, don't cry. Daddy didn't leave you. He just went to buy groceries. He'll be back soon to cook for you. Don't you like Daddy's cooking the most? What do you want to eat tonight? I don't want to eat, I want Daddy. The little guy kicked the bed, still throwing a tantrum. Qin Ruiying had no choice but to hug her gently and keep trying to reason with her. After a long while, after the little girl calmed down a little, Qin Ruiying immediately picked her up and carried her to the bathroom. Let's go. Don't you want to pee? Mama will take you there. Be careful not to wet the bed again. Hearing this, the little guy was like a cat whose tail had been stepped on. He immediately pouted and shouted softly, I don't wet the bed. In the past life and in this life, the two looked at each other. The sword and the sword were used to cut off their worries. I walk alone in the heavens and under the earth. I am duty-bound and crazy for love. This set of sword and saber techniques didn't originate from the heavenly Yen divine sect. Instead, it was an ancient inheritance that Xianxia obtained by chance. The dark heaven evil emperor. The third form of the saber, the third form of the sword. The third form of sword and saber. 3 by 3 is inexhaustible, 9 by 9 returns to 1. The saber cut the wind, the sword cut the clouds, and the wind and clouds were disturbed. Although it was a divine skill, it didn't change the fact that Xianxia's cultivation had been damaged. Xianxia, who was seriously injured, faced the divine general who was in his peak state. The divine general held the golden crow in his hand. It was like the sun had descended to earth. Thousands of golden pillars of fire swore to burn everything in the world to ashes. Xianxia's face was as calm as water. After the sword and saber slashed out, 2 huge shadows appeared in the sky. A saber and a sword instantly collided with the scorching fireball. When the saber and sword shadows collided with the raging flames in the sky, the entire world shook. The shockwave that shot out in all directions instantly dimmed the 5 golden pillars. The huge cloud vortex in the sky also trembled, almost being torn apart by the violent strength qi and vanishing into thin air. The spirit binding array was on the verge of collapse. A few elders hid behind the hill behind the ancestral hall. After the wind and smoke dissipated, they cautiously poked their heads out. The scene in front of them completely stunned them. Annihilation. Everything was annihilated. This village with a long history was instantly razed to the ground by such a violent collision. When the smoke and dust dissipated, a huge circular crater with a diameter of hundreds of meters appeared below the two of them. The land was originally flat, the houses were neat, and there were fertile fields, beautiful ponds, mulberry trees, and other plants. It was a paradise where chickens and dogs could hear each other. Now it was completely gone. Even the small hill that they were hiding in had been cut in half. The divine general was still floating in the air. He wasn't wearing a shirt, revealing his strong muscles. The flames that kept rising around him like flames had already disappeared. Chi. There were no scars on his bronze-colored skin. But then the divine general was like a broken shower head. Tiny flowers of blood splattered all over his body. Not long after, his entire body was dyed red with blood. Xianxia held the saber in his left hand and the sword in his right as if he had never moved. But if one looked closely they would find that Xianxia was in a very strange state. His eyes were empty as if he had lost his soul. The saber and sword were still in his hands, but there was a faint blood-red light around him. The confidence and wild laughter on the divine general's face had disappeared, leaving only fear. He was scared. Because his injuries were too serious he couldn't even maintain flying. So the divine general immediately made a wise decision. Run. However, the moment he turned around, the blood-red light behind him lit up. The blood-red light that was as delicate and beautiful as fresh blood instantly dyed the entire sky red. The pillar of light that pierced through the clouds disappeared. The cloud vortex dissipated. The tortoise-shell-like golden barrier slowly turned into white smoke and disappeared. The wind and snow were still in the sky. The cold wind whistled through the sky with snowflakes. It was as if summer had turned to winter in an instant. A blood-red sword light suddenly slashed out. Bang! The hillside where the elders were hiding was immediately razed to the ground. Where is the soul of Xian? The cold and emotionless voice suddenly sounded in the sky. Hearing this, the leading old man immediately knelt on the ground and kowtowed heavily. Then he tremblingly took out a black box and shouted, "The soul of the mysterious fairy is here. If I may be so bold, please spare our lives, immortal master." He knelt on the ground and held the box tightly with both hands as if he was begging for mercy. This box was their only chance to live. If that man didn't agree, then they could only destroy this box. They would fight to the death. However, just as the old man was about to say something, a long sword of frost and snow suddenly formed in the sky above his head. Then a blood-red sword light suddenly fell. Thud! The box fell to the ground and rolled a few times before lying down quietly in the mud. Xianxia casually waved his hand. The box seemed to have sensed something. After trembling slightly, it suddenly flew into his hand. After getting the box, Xianxia glanced around indifferently. The village had been reduced to nothing. The villagers had also retreated to the edge of the array. Everyone huddled together and trembled as they looked at the godlike man in the sky. He thought for a moment, then turned around and flew in the direction he came from. However, the moment he turned around and flew away, 6 blood-red sword lights suddenly appeared in the sky. Chapter 130. In the courtyard, Qin Ruiying took the little fellow to the bathroom and wiped her face with a hot towel. The little fellow stopped crying at this time. She stood on the ground with her mouth pursed and her face full of grievance, but she looked very cute. Because she had just washed her face, the little fellow's little face was red. Like a ripe red apple, Qin Ruiying could not help but reach out and gently pinch her pink little face. "I want to pee." As if to show her independence, the little fellow quickly ran to the side of the toilet and sat on it by herself. It was the first time Qin Ruiying saw her daughter go to the bathroom, and she could not help but feel a little strange. However, she was worried that the little fellow would fall, so she quickly walked over and gently held her. After going to the bathroom, the little fellow did not want Qin Ruiying to hold her and ran out without washing her hands. Qin Ruiying quickly followed behind her and found that she wanted to open the door and go out, so she quickly stopped her and asked nervously, "Nian Nian, where are you going?" She was afraid that the little fellow would run out to find her father. However, the little fellow did not seem to have that idea but pouted and replied, "Papa said that after watching an episode of cartoons we should go out and exercise. I want to exercise." Hearing this, Qin Ruiying could only smile bitterly and open the door for her. This child, 3 sentences without leaving her father's side, did not consider her mother's feelings. A gust of cold wind suddenly blew in when the door opened. The little fellow shivered but did not shrink back. Instead she shouted loudly, big cat, let's go play in the yard." Meow. The big cat lay at the foot of the bed, seemingly unwilling to move. Seeing this, the little fellow was immediately unhappy. She quickly ran to the side of the bed and pressed down on the big cat. Then she took it into her arms and carried it out of the west wing. "Papa said that you have to play with me." Meow. Although the big cat was a monster, it still had the nature of an animal, so when winter came it was lazy and did not want to move much. However, since the little fellow said so, it had to obediently accompany her. The inner courtyard had been completely destroyed by Xianxia and there was a big hole in the middle. Qin Ruiying was afraid that she would run into the hole and fall, so she quickly said, Nian, just play on the steps. What do you want to play? Mommy can play with you. The little fellow put the big cat and seemed to think that there was no way to play in the yard, so she could not help but wrinkle her little face as if she was thinking about what she should play. Seeing this, Qin Ruoying immediately racked her brains to think of something. What to play? She had to say, as a mother's therefore it was best to take this opportunity to cultivate a good relationship with the little fellow. Qin Ruoying thought for a while, and then suddenly came up with a wonderful idea, so she immediately said to the little fellow, Nian, mommy will play hide and seek with you, how about it? Hide and seek? The little fellow was stunned for a moment and then jumped up happily. She was so happy that she clapped her hands and shouted, Okay. I want to play hide and seek. She had been yearning for hide and seek for a long time. It was just that she used to live in the Kangju district and that house was too small, so she could not play. Aunt Zhang did not like her to run around in the district, so she had never allowed her to play hide and seek with other children. Therefore, when Qin Ruoying proposed this idea, the little fellow was immediately excited. The courtyard was so big and there were so many rooms. It was perfect for playing hide and seek. The mother and daughter quickly reached a consensus. Qin Ruoying found and the little fellow hid. After the discussion, Qin Ruoying leaned against the wall and loudly chanted the 30-second countdown. Hearing her countdown, the little fellow, who was still giggling, immediately panicked. She looked around for a while, then suddenly jumped into the west wing and then hurriedly hid in the closet. The west wing was the place she was most familiar with, so her first reaction was to go back to the room. This was the first time she played hide and seek, so she did not have much experience, so she made a lot of noise. After Qin Ruoying finished counting down, she walked into the room with a faint smile. After looking around, she knew that the little fellow must have hidden in the closet. Nian, where did you hide? Mommy can't find you, she pretended to wander around the room. The little fellow covered her mouth with both hands and nervously hid in the closet. She didn't even dare to breathe. Qin Ruoying counted the time. About 2 minutes later, she approached the wardrobe as she spoke. Because she was afraid of scaring the little fellow, she paused outside the closet for a while, and then slowly opened the closet door. Found you. Mommy, you're amazing. Seeing Qin Ruoying open the wardrobe door, the little girl didn't hide anymore. She immediately jumped into Qin Ruoying's arms and giggled. How is it? Is it fun? It's fun. I want to play more. Well, I'll give you another chance. This time you have to hide better, okay? The little guy nodded his head heavily. Looking at her excited little face, she had probably long forgotten about her father. If you want to get along with children happily, you have to have 3 hearts. Patience, love, and consideration. What's more, Nian was Qin Ruoying's favorite. Therefore, after she adjusted her state of mind, she immediately played with the little fellow. With her mother's company, time passed quickly. When Qin Ruoying found the little fellow for the 5th time, Xianxia finally came back. Like a gust of wind, he appeared in the courtyard without a sound. Qin Ruoying followed the little fellow. As soon as she walked out of the room, she saw Xianxia. She froze for a moment. But the little fellow had already rushed to Xianxia, shouting, Papa! Xianxia was afraid that she would slip, so he quickly stepped forward and picked her up. What's wrong? What are you playing? Hide and seek. Mommy, play hide and seek with me. Is it fun? It's fun. Qin Ruoying looked at Xianxia in a daze. Xianxia was playing with the little fellow in his arms as if there was nothing strange. What else did he want to hide? But could he hide it? Perhaps seeing the worry in Qin Ruoying's eyes, Xianxia put the little fellow down with a smile, then touched her head and said with a smile, Nian, it's cold outside. Go back to the room first. Seeing that her father was back, the little fellow was relieved, so she ran back to the room happily. After the little fellow left, Qin Ruoying finally couldn't help but grab Xianxia's arm and ask anxiously, Are you hurt? Where is the injury? Is it serious? As she spoke, she looked up and down at Xianxia nervously. Xianxia had no trace of injury. However, his face was devoid of any color and his lips were deathly pale. He looked like a patient who had lost too much blood. I'm fine, don't worry. Chapter 131. Xianxia handed the box to Qin Ruoying as if she was presenting a treasure. She thought that Qin Ruoying would be very happy, but she didn't expect that after seeing the box, Qin Ruoying had a complicated expression on her face. Xianxia didn't understand, so he asked in confusion, Ying, what's wrong? Are you unhappy? Qin Ruoying didn't say anything, but her expression was also complicated. Xianxia thought she didn't understand the importance of this, so he explained, "The reason you can't sense qi is because when you became Xian, they extracted your earthly soul. A person has 3 spiritual and 7 physical souls. Without one spiritual soul, you can't be considered a complete person. It's because of this that you can't cultivate." Before Xianxia could finish, Qin Ruiying suddenly interrupted him. "I can choose not to cultivate." With that, Qin Ruiying hurriedly took Xianxia's hand and sighed softly, "Do you know what my wish was when I was 8 years old?" "The wish you made when you became Xiannu?" "Yes, Xiannu can make a wish. I didn't have the same ambition as Yuan Qing back then, so my wish was very simple. I only wanted to live a peaceful and happy life like a normal person." When she said this, Xianxia suddenly understood something. He looked at Qin Ruiying's serious expression and couldn't help but gently pull her into his arms. Then he said solemnly to her, "I'm sorry, Yingying, I made you worry." Xianxia hadn't been injured in the battle with the Divine General. However, he had paid a heavy price because of this. Because he had burned another drop of essence blood. Essence blood, the essence of blood, was also the life source of a cultivator. Essence blood contained enormous energy. Many demonic and evil techniques even relied on stealing the essence blood of others to increase their own cultivation. Xianxia used a secret technique to burn his essence blood, allowing himself to explode with power close to his peak for a short period of time. This allowed him to successfully kill the Divine General, who was comparable to a complete Yuanying. Essence blood wasn't present at birth, but gradually condensed as a cultivator's cultivation grew. After 500 years of accumulation, Xianxia had actually only accumulated 3 drops of essence blood. Before returning to Earth, he had already burned a drop because he didn't have enough vital essence. The Divine General had burned another drop. Therefore, he only had 1 drop of essence blood left. If he lost even this drop of essence blood, Xianxia wouldn't be far from death. Regret? Absolutely not. Even if I die, my heart won't be covered in dust. Qin Ruiying looked at Xianxia's slightly pale face and couldn't help but reach out to touch it. After feeling the warmth from his face, Qin Ruiying couldn't help but murmur, "Maybe it's because of Xiannu's identity that I've basically fulfilled all the wishes I've made before. Just think of it as greed, so I have a new wish." Speaking of this, Qin Ruiying suddenly laughed, then turned to look at the room. At this time, the little girl's giggles sounded in the room. "Silly child, watching cartoons alone can make you convulse with laughter." After the Earth Soul returned to its original position, Qin Xueqing really found the sense of qi. That kind of mysterious feeling made her, a martial arts fanatic, immediately intoxicated. Faintly, she even had an illusion. The long-sealed gate of the Alchemy state seemed to finally show a sign of loosening. She could finally step into the Alchemy state. Qin Wanqing was still struggling to break through to the Alchemy realm. Qin Yongyan, on the other hand, started cultivating a few days earlier than her and took the spirit-gathering pill. Therefore, he smoothly stepped into the early stage of qi refinement and directly stepped into the Alchemy realm. He was now a grandmaster of the Alchemy state. This also made him more convinced that what Xianxia taught them was much more powerful than martial arts. His father-in-law and sister-in-law were both obsessed with cultivation, so they didn't even come out for dinner. Xianxia didn't want to interrupt this kind of state where they forgot to eat and sleep, so he left some food in the refrigerator for them. After dinner, Xianxia wanted Qin Ruiying to also cultivate. But at this time, Qin Ruiying shook her head and proposed to take a walk in Hohai. Take a walk. The little girl was lying on the bed. After hearing her mother's suggestion, she immediately raised her hands and feet, expressing her absolute approval. Being cooped up at home every day, this little girl was about to become moldy. In winter, the sun set early. It wasn't even 7 o'clock in the evening, but some places without street lights were already pitch black. Outside the big house, one could see the old street light at the entrance of Dongming Alley. The light of the street light was slightly yellow, elongating the shadows of the family of 3. The little girl held Qin Ruiying's left hand and Xianxia's right hand. She squatted on the snow, and her 2 small cotton boots seemed to have turned into skis, constantly yelling for them to run. Just like the sleigh pulling the carriage at Christmas, her parents were the elk pulling the carriage. And she was Santa Claus bringing joy to the mortal world. Since their daughter had this request, her parents had to agree even if they had to work like cows or horses. Thus, Qin Ruiying and Xianxia looked at each other and smiled, and immediately pulled her to a trot. "Giddy up. Horse run. Horse run." The sleigh started running and the little girl's 2 feet immediately pulled a long track on the ground. She was so happy that she giggled, feeling that it seemed to be more interesting than riding a big cat. Qin Ruiying's physical fitness was average. In winter she wore a lot of clothes and the snow was difficult to walk on, so after running for a while she was tired and panting. And because she was so happy she kept laughing. The intense exercise and the stimulation of the cold air immediately caused a sharp pain in her abdomen. Exercise-induced abdominal pain. Ouch. Qin Ruiying gasped for air as she clutched her stomach and groaned. Seeing this, Xianxia quickly stopped. Xianxia used his true essence to help her recuperate. After seeing that she was better, Xianxia said to the little girl, "Mommy's body isn't good. Yan, come, Daddy will play with you. Today I'll let you experience what it means to be fast and furious." After Qin Ruiying stopped, the little girl sat down on the ground. Hearing Xianxia's words, she immediately stretched out her hands and took Xianxia's right hand. "Little princess, let's go." After that, Xianxia started running. In this kind of snow they couldn't run too fast. If the little girl couldn't control herself, she would be dragged to the ground by Xianxia. Therefore, Xianxia could only pay attention to the little girl's state while slowly speeding up. In fact, the speed was not very fast, but the little girl was very excited. She happily giggled and said, "Papa, come on. Papa, come on." It was really much more fun than riding a big cat. Hohai had not completely frozen and the skating rink had not been opened, so now Shikahai looked a little deserted. The weather was still too cold, so the family of 3 returned home after a round. In the evening, after the little girl fell asleep, Qin Ruiying finally began to cultivate. She had figured it out. If she neglected her daughter because of cultivation, then she was not worthy of being Yan's mother. In a dark room, the little girl fell asleep sweetly, while Xianxia and Qin Ruiying sat cross-legged on her left and right. Suddenly Xianxia opened his eyes.